listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I'm your indefatigable, ever-vigilant, burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And that means that together, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How are you doing, Jamarl?
I'm doing fine. I'm sorry. I wasn't laughing at anything that was going on. I'm reading this announcement. Belarus announced temporary closure of oil pipeline to the European Union.
There you go. Well, that's going to piss everybody off.
Yes.
Literally.
Yes.
Everybody.
Yeah.
There you go. We'll come back to that because there are updates in that story having to do with the migrants being housed in a warehouse and that big update, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But without further ado, hope everybody's having a good morning. It's just past 7 a.m. Eastern. It is November 17th, this 2021 winter season. Well, fall, I think. But heading into winter, it's starting to feel pretty wintry in D.C. here.
Yeah, it's getting cold.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very cold.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into headlines. First up in COVID stats. Yesterday in the United States, there were 89,966 new COVID cases reported. There were also 1,414 new deaths from COVID-19. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 85,861 cases per day. That's an increase of 18% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 69% of residents have now received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And to give you the total stats, as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,275,212 people across the United States, and it has killed 764,592 people here. The United States plans to pay upwards of $5 billion to buy enough doses of Pfizer's anti-COVID-19 pill molnupiravir to treat up to 10 million people. Pfizer yesterday applied for emergency authorization of the drug with the FDA. The treatment is to be taken as a regimen of 30 pills over 5 days, over the course of 5 days. So 6 pills a day, a lot of pills, and also a lot of money. About $500 per course of this drug. What's that? About $16 a pill. A decent amount of money per pill. It's not like the thousands that I associate with that one random, who's that one dude, Martin Shkreli?
Yeah.
You know, this guy
he upped it like 1,000% or something.
Exactly,
some
the AIDS drug. Remember that. So my point is, that's where my mind goes with truly extreme. But on the other hand, you know, $500 a course is kind of expensive.
That guy was being a good capitalist.
Sounds kind of expensive.
In fact, when they even hit him on that one, he was like, no, my job, right?
And then
I'm supposed to maximize my profit.
Yep, and then he has a secret following. Well, not secret, but he has a following of people online who are like, Martin Shkreli did nothing wrong. He's like diehard followers. I think partly because he's a big fan of like the Wu-Tang Clan.
Really?
He's a big fan of them. He like bought an exclusive record of theirs for like an insane sum of money back in the day.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
So he has this weird reputation anyway.
That's funny.
That's a true tangent. But yeah, we can come back maybe to talk about this bill and the price tag. Again, a little bit later in the show. Anyway, carrying on with headlines. In national news, jurors weighing charges against Kyle Rittenhouse are to return for a second day of deliberations. If convicted, Rittenhouse will face life in prison for killing 2 men and wounding a third with an assault rifle. The case went to the anonymous jury after the judge, in an unusual move, allowed Rittenhouse himself to reach into a raffle drum and draw numbered slips determining who will decide his fate. That task is usually performed by a court clerk, not the defendant.
It's very weird.
It is very weird. That's like a movie scene moment.
Yeah.
In a weird way.
I don't trust this judge.
I kind of don't trust this judge at this point either. That's it's kind of bizarre. You decide your fate. Decide your fate, young man. Grab the slips from the hat. No, I'm just kidding. It's a raffle drum, not a hat. In international news, suicide bombers have targeted the Ugandan capital, Kampala, killing at least 3 people, injuring over 30 others there. The number of dead is likely to rise. There have been a number of bomb explosions in recent weeks in Uganda. Last month, a 20-year-old waitress was killed after a device in a shopping bag detonated in a bar in the city. Police believe bomb threats are still active in the capital. Belarusian authorities moved today to house migrants on their border with Poland in a large red brick warehouse, several hundred yards from the border crossing. Western officials have called the migrant crisis a hybrid war waged by Belarus's President Lukashenko against the European Union as retaliation for their sanctions and for housing Belarusian political dissidents, such as Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. The migrants, meanwhile, seem to be thankful simply to be indoors after weeks spent outside on the increasingly cold border. The suspect who was killed in a taxi explosion in the United Kingdom in the city of Liverpool is said to have spent at least 6 months preparing for the attack by buying components for the bomb. We're speaking about Ahmad Al-Swayman, 32 years old, who died when a blast ripped through his cab in which he was a passenger as it pulled up outside Liverpool Women's Hospital on Sunday morning. Taxi driver was injured. He himself died. Bomber himself died. Anyway, with that, those are our headlines, most of them at least. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We also have holidays as per usual. Today is GIS Day, Geographic Information Systems, GIS Day. It's not mainly for like geography lovers and enthusiasts who are just a big fan of the GIS system, which is a pretty useful system. I've used that before, of course. Guinness World Records Day. Also National Baklava Day. And baklava is delicious enough, in my opinion, that it totally deserves its own day.
Baklava is phenomenal.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, it is. And with that, those are our holiday headlines. We've already done the outro, of course. Yeah. Anyway.
So, there's another article out. Cuomo may have to forfeit millions earned from pandemic memoir. This is New York State Ethics Panel revoked its approval that allowed Andrew Cuomo to write a book contending that he broke his promise not to use state resources. Now, see, I took it as they were going to force him to take that money back just because, you wrote a book talking about how awesome you were.
Yeah.
When you have all of these people basically dead and you basically ends up losing your job because you can't keep your hands to yourself. And you're basically trying to hide the number of dead grandmas that you have in your particular state, many of which are caused by you. But this is basically saying the money that he earned from the 2020 pandemic memoir after State Board of Ethics on Tuesday voted to revoke authorization for the book. The Joint Commission on Public Ethics accused Mr. Cuomo of essentially obtaining approval under false pretenses, including breaking his promise to not use state resources towards completion of the memoir. Quote, contrary to representation made on behalf of Governor Cuomo and not to disclose to the commission state property, resources, and personnel, including staff volunteers, were used in connection with preparation, writing, editing, publication of the book according to the resolution that was approved 12-1 vote. So he basically was using state resources to write a dodgy book about how awesome he was, while at the exact same time lying about the number of people that basically died in New York from COVID, hiding that number of people while chest thumping about how great he's doing and how horrible everybody else is doing, how he's better than the experts and all this other stuff. I mean, honestly, there was a potential that he could even be charged for this. I mean, because their thought was, okay, the money that he got from this, did he do what he did because he didn't necessarily want the public exposed to how horrible he was doing in New York on COVID? And if you're making money off of something that might have actually been illegal, this kind of hiding the ball on the COVID stuff, well, were you financially incentivized to do that? I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily know if it's going to go that far, but if nothing else, that memoir about him being great, not so much.
I hear you. And I think a lot of people are pretty happy to see Cuomo suffering more losses after knowing the full extent of what he did in terms of not just the sexual assaults, but also most importantly, of course, the nursing home incident where he probably killed a lot of old people in the state by moving them, from nursing homes with COVID-19 to hospitals and then immediately back to the nursing homes without knowing that they'd fully recovered, basically, without diligently testing them to make sure that they were ready to go.
He forbade them to even get tested.
Exactly.
Yeah, he didn't even allow it.
Exactly, to minimize the numbers. And then, of course, Letitia James, part of how her, headhuntery pursuit of Andrew Cuomo started was with her report on this.
Yeah.
Where she just dropped the report basically saying that New York State was systematically undercounting deaths in nursing homes from COVID-19 by half, basically, by a factor of missing half of them. Turns out, again, it just dropped that report, didn't make a big deal out of it necessarily, but of course the report itself is a big deal. So report got dropped. Immediately, they changed their numbers to fit what she had said in her report. Yeah. So there's a sort of recognition, okay, yeah, we screwed this up. Then a little bit after that, of course, Cuomo started to get all this attention because of the sexual harassment, sexual assault allegations that were going around. But that was the first big report, and that was how Letitia James started that. I don't know that she had a vendetta necessarily, but Cuomo was clearly a ripe target, and that was the first attack on that target, if I'm just looking at it in terms of pure raw politics or whatever. But here's the thing, man. A lot of people happy to see Cuomo taking more L's on this one. The only thing that I would be concerned about, and I'm not concerned about it enough to do anything more than raise it as a point, is, say this is the kind of thing that's kind of actually standard. Say Cuomo using state funds to benefit himself by writing this book, this fraudulent book, building up this, reputation that he shouldn't have been building up because he was a liar.
Yeah.
How many people do that? And if everybody does that, and this is the selective application of justice against him just because people are after him right now, then there's a way in which I want to be like, hey, that's itself kind of a thing that we should watch and be worried about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there could come along a time where a good guy suddenly does something, ends up breaking a rule, and then has justice selectively applied to them. And I don't want to put myself in a position where I'm like, okay, I was okay when it happened to Cuomo, and now what am I supposed to say when it happens to this good guy? If that makes sense. I don't know. But then on the other hand, maybe you should have politicians who just don't break the rules like this, who don't do things like this, don't do self-profiting, self-serving things like this at all. And that's why at the end of the day, I'm like, hey, yeah, Cuomo, take the money, take the money away.
Whether it's a good guy or a bad guy, you shouldn't be doing no mess like this. I mean, you're basically using state resources to self-serving aims.
Exactly. And I'm making the general selective justice point.
Yeah.
Not with this specific kind of crime, because again, this is self-serving and bad.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. But, I mean, I totally get it. I guess the catch is how many people, I suppose pretty much every politician, not every, but a ton of politicians write books. So that's something that definitely happens. How many of them use state resources? That's the other part. And then you get to this other one, smaller number still. How many of them use state resources to basically write a book? That's basically lying about how awesome they were.
Yes.
I mean, didn't they take away his Emmy also, if I'm not mistaken?
Yep.
They took away the Emmy also because he got an Emmy on that part. Astonishing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Very astonishing. But yeah, I mean, Cuomo at this point, I don't know what he's going to do in his future career or what comes after this. But yeah, he left a stinker in New York in the governorship.
A week ago, Chris Cuomo, his brother, I just decided to check up on his brother because, of course, it's a political family.
Yeah.
His brother, newscaster. CNN's Chris Cuomo notches all-time ratings low 1 week ago.
Really?
And this is after Chris Cuomo was taking all that flack, not just last year, but, of course, more so earlier this year after Cuomo stepped down as governor. That whole process rolled through. For his soft glove treatment with his brother, for giving his brother a platform when he was doing well and refusing to cover the story when it came out that his brother was guilty of all this stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
His Chris Cuomo, the newscaster brother, was getting a bunch of flack, and it kind of accelerated. And then I hadn't heard about him for a while. And so go give him a quick Google search, give him a Goog, and it turns out he's doing terribly, as is to be expected. And I think this is pretty consistent with a lot of the rest of the MSM right now.
Yeah.
People are just out of it. They don't like what the crowd has to offer because they see that they do this kind of thing.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily look all that good, and it's not necessarily all that good reflection on the various people. Honestly, I'm surprised that there wasn't more people concerned about the deaths as opposed to sexual assault. It seems that the deaths, I guess, opened him to attack, with the sexual assault being the dagger in the heart.
It's just salacious.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that could be it too.
It's attention grabbing,
Yeah, it's like, whoa, he did what? What did he do? Who did he touch?
Where did he touch? Wait, what? Exactly. And people are like, their mind gets grabbed on it. And then it's like the emotional side of it. It's like the million deaths is a statistic, a single death is a tragedy.
Yeah.
You get the paraphrase of the quote that I'm going for.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing too.
It seems so big that the numbers, it's hard to grasp, whereas the individual death, matters that much more. Yeah, that's pretty wild stuff, man. So yeah, I agree with you on this. I'm not weeping at all for Cuomo losing his check on this one.
Yes.
The Belarus thing is fascinating to me because, like we were saying yesterday, we're going to be talking about this later today with Peter Oliver. But this is not Belarus's oil, their gas. And when this initially first came up, it was like, wait a minute, does Lukashenko own that gas? I mean, they have gas supplies like that where they're shipping out. Well, no, it's just going through his country. And so now it's like, hey, we need to have unscheduled repairs on the oil going to the European Union. Yeah, we need unscheduled repairs. That's what it is. Now, when this was brought up once before, Putin was basically like, yeah, I didn't hear anything about that. And I've talked to him multiple times, and this particular subject didn't come up. I suppose that subject didn't come up because he knew what the answer was going to be. Yeah, dude, no, you're not doing that. Now, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes where it's a wink and a nod or something like that. But in the open, the conversation was basically, yeah, no, you're not going to do that. That's not your gas. It's just going through your country. It's not your gas. Now, the catch becomes, would he be willing to risk this if he didn't have, let's say, Russian support, considering that that's basically his only ally in the region?
That's the thing. I don't know what else he would go.
Yeah.
Remember when we first started talking about this, I didn't know too much about Belarus. I remember even frankly being confused about the location. I swapped the location of Poland and Belarus in my mind. It doesn't make sense. I mean, literally, it was just a stupid gaffe. My point was that was my level of familiarity with the country. But I remember talking about it very, very early on. I think with Mark Sloboda, he brought up the idea of the union state, effectively a union, sort of pursued briefly during the late 90s between Belarus and Russia, where they would rejoin as a country. And this is, again, Soviet Union collapses a few years later. These two countries are trying to talk, they're talking about this, pursuing this potentially. That's where my mind went when I was thinking about the long run sort of political objectives of Belarus as a state. Because right now, marginalized by the EU, completely treated as the last dictator in Europe, whatever, the last strongman in Europe, basically ostracized.
Yeah.
Putin and Russia, not exactly happy with them in all these different ways. It's not like the Western media treats them as if, again, Lukashenko is Putin's lapdog or something. And that's not true from either end. Lukashenko does what he wants very clearly.
Yeah.
He's his own person. And, the same thing with Russia. So anyway, that would be the clear political trajectory, looking at least, not the Union state necessarily, but at least they're going to continue to align with them. Left without Russia, who do they have? I have no clue.
That's the question.
No clue at all.
Are you going to bite the hand that basically is your only ally in the region by cutting the gas by yourself? I mean, it just seems to be somewhat of a drastic act. Look, I get it, right? You're in this kind of back and forth with Europe. These guys are putting sanctions on you. You don't particularly like them. They tried to overthrow your government at one point. And you're in this kind of back and forth, tit for tat. Totally get it. But the item that you're using in order to kind of get back at them, it's not really yours. And because the item is not necessarily yours, and it belongs to basically a friend of yours, are you going to do something like that without consulting the friend first? And that's where I get dicey about it. Because he may say, like, all right, these are unscheduled repairs, with the kind of political distinction of, hey, man, it just happened. It just happened. I know I said this, but it's just coincidental that this particular happened. I mean, you can lean on that. Nobody is going to believe that, but you can totally lean on it. Most people get the point of, if you have automatically unscheduled repairs after telling them you're going to shut the oil down if they put through sanctions, well, or shut the gas down, then it looks dicey, to put it mildly. By the same token, it is possible for him to take this tact on his own. I don't know. I mean, with the thought that I can always just apologize and back away from it, but I wanted to teach Europe a lesson.
Maybe.
It's hard to know.
Or he's just trying to play hardball because he realizes that both Russia and the EU have a lot to gain from this gas flowing through Belarus, and it's the main leverage that he has over both of them.
Yeah.
And so he's like, okay, I'm going to push this and see what I get. And
Oh, man, but do you lose leverage against your only friend like that? That's the catch.
Yeah, you might. But you also might gain leverage by it. And it seems like that's the move that he's playing it. And I don't know. I don't want to psychoanalyze him too much, but one of my faults is that my mind tends to go there in a lot of cases. Okay, what's this person's motivation? And I'm imagining Lukashenko towards
What his friends call him, Luko.
I know, yeah, I don't want to use that. I don't want to get on a nickname basis. But I imagine Lukashenko later in his life, the last dictator of Europe, being like, you know what? Let's go for something or something like that. But I don't know. I'd love to talk with Mark, somebody who's more in the know.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I got to be honest, though. I don't think he gets any leverage by screwing over Putin on this. I mean, if that's your only buddy, your only ally, do you really take an act that undermines what that person says? I mean, because what does he have to gain out of it if Putin starts backing away?
I could paint myself a picture where Lukashenko, again, I don't want to, the psychoanalysis business is super risky, but I could paint myself a picture where he's resentful and he's like, why aren't they privileging us in this relationship? Why aren't they, more on our side when it comes to the EU?
That emotional tangent will have consequences for him. I'll tell you that much.
Of course it would. My point is I have no idea, and I could be completely off base there, but there are those kinds of biases that are very easy to imagine, would be completely visible in hindsight, certainly, and with any familiarity with the actual person, and that would completely explain a lot of these kinds of things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or at least go a long way to explaining it. Let's go into a breakdown. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas, and Stranahan will be coming back in Jamarl's monologue soapbox segment. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines.
Radio Sputnik.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area or happen to be passing through the area, you can always join us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Biden has just passed his his bipartisan infrastructure bill. The Build Back Better agenda is still sitting on the sidelines at this point. And it is unknown whether or not that agenda is necessarily going to get over the finish line. It's unclear. One of the things that is clear, however, is that Biden has been taking it in the teeth in regards to his polling. One poll after the next, seemingly getting progressively worse. One after the other after the other. He's only been in office for a little bit less than a year. And within the context of that year, his polling has dropped all the way down to 38%. In a USA Today Suffolk poll, and even in many of the Washington Post and some of the other polls, Biden is not over the 40% mark or barely over the 40% mark. Kamala Harris, believe it or not, is even faring worse, which doesn't even seem possible considering how bad people are viewing Biden's presidency. And this includes a lot of Democrats, meaning the number of people who basically said, we thought he would be doing better than this, was basically like 48% in regards to Democrats. Of course, Republicans are higher and independents are higher. This shouldn't be a mystery, though. If you think about one issue after the next, whether you're talking about the AUKUS deal, whether you're talking about whether you're talking about the COVID numbers, meaning him not having control of COVID when coming into office, the pullout of Afghanistan, or let's say the screw up in regards to pulling out of Afghanistan and the dishonesty associated with it, or for that matter, looking like he didn't necessarily know what was taking place in regards to the pullout, going so far as to say, you're not going to see scenes like Vietnam. And then you saw, basically within a day or so, scenes that looked like Vietnam. He didn't even seem to know whether or not the country was going to fall as fast as the country did. And then when you keep moving on forward, you get to domestic policy. And for the last 5 or 6 months, despite the things that Biden had basically promised that he was going to get done, he didn't get done any of that stuff. Yes, he did get the checks out. But again, if you remember, the checks were supposed to be $2,000. And not to nitpick, this was also something that Donald Trump was trying to do himself, meaning Biden spent $1.9 trillion. Donald Trump was trying to do $1.8 trillion, and the party basically stopped him from doing that. So when you're looking at accomplishments, they seem to be very, very few. And you'd be looking at screw-ups or incompetence or things where he just seems to be out of touch. It seems to be very, very many. I don't think that's correct English, but I think you get my point. Joanne Reid is in the dark on this. She doesn't quite get it. She doesn't understand it. And she's musing, basically, like why Americans don't like this president, this great, great man. Why don't they like this great, great man? Why is his polling at 38% like that? Why is her polling at 28%? America just don't know when it's got it so good. She made this point. She was having a conversation with historian Michael Betcharles on Read Out. And she basically made the point, she says, quote, I hate to really dwell on polls because they're ephemeral. And at this point, in many presidencies, a lot of presidents face a crisis of public confidence. And Joe Biden faces a massive ongoing COVID nightmare that is harming his numbers. His numbers are pretty low right now. She made the point. There are also a lot of Americans who, despite having gotten shots, the checks are still telling pollsters that he's accomplished nothing or almost nothing, which I find to be amazing. I guess they spent the whole $2,000 and now they're not happy anymore. Does size matter? Should we think about it in terms of those polling numbers? Her point is basically, how are these people upset? I mean, my life is going phenomenal. Why aren't they excited about this? And then going so far as to basically say, Okay, so I guess they split their $2,000 check. For one, it wasn't $2,000, it was $1,400. And two, the notion that a check that people got almost like 6, 7, 8 months ago was the only and deciding factor or spending of that check of why they dislike Joe Biden or why Biden polling numbers are that low. It takes a Democrat to say something like that. At the end of the day, whether you're talking about independents, whether you're talking about Republicans, or for that matter, even when you're talking about many Democrats, they are greatly unsatisfied with Joe Biden. The guy fell asleep on the international stage at the climate summit. I mean, and even before that, you have these issues of Biden just not seemingly being aware of what is taking place around him and having an inability to get anything done. Yes, as I said, he did get the 1,400 out. Okay, fair enough. But what else? And therein lies the rub. If you tell the American public $15 an hour and anything less is a starvation wage, okay, then there's an expectation that you're going to do something about the fact that all of these people are living and working with a starvation wage. Think about the term, starvation wage. That's a big deal, right? And if you're the president and you're going to throw a circle around that, even getting into a debate with the previous president, that you're going to do something about that, and then you get your opportunity and you don't, what are people to think? That looks horrible. What about marijuana? The marijuana has a higher approval rating than Biden and Kamala Harris combined. And yet, again, off the table, despite the fact that Biden directly, I could play the quote, said, yes, I am going to do something about basically changing the scheduling of marijuana and pot. He didn't do that. Student loans, didn't do anything on that. Even one of the most popular plans, the Medicare for All stuff, or expanding Medicare to include dental and vision, something that would affect like 40 million people, and expanding the number of people that have access to it. The most popular proposal, by the way, in everything that he's talked about. And we're in the middle of a pandemic with 700 and some thousand people that have died. So it's timely. It's right on point in regards to what we're going through as a nation, as a country. And you wonder whether this number of people have died if you had something like that. Even that's off the table. Meaning the main provisions that the people actually loved, enjoyed, wanted, and wanted Biden to push for, and that Biden basically said he was going to push for, he didn't do. So on one hand, you have a president that seemed to not to be altogether there. And on the other hand, not to be able to get anything legitimate accomplished. And again, this is in context of 700,000 people that have basically dropped dead over the course of a year and a half. I got to be honest. I'm not quite sure why Joanne Reid is so confused on this point. But whatever her reasoning or whatever she thinks or whatever she frames her mind into thinking, it is not that people have just spent the $1,400, again, not $2,000. It's not that they've spent the $1,400 and they're like, okay, now I hate them now because I don't have any money. It's not that. It's everything else. I don't quite understand why she doesn't necessarily see this. I mean, this is an MSNBC thing, Shane. And so, you know, she's a Democrat. And of course, they're going to protect their guy. That's their job on some level. But she's acting as if she's like shocked by this. I don't understand what this American public is thinking. And then when you get all of these people, I think it was 50% or more, basically saying, yeah, he's not doing anything in that office. I mean, it's a large number. I think it's more than that. She's like, I don't get it. What don't you get? What does she think that he was in there doing in regards to accomplishments? I'm unaware of what she's talking about. Outside of the COVID bill, I mean, yes, he just passed the infrastructure package, but that's like 5 or 6 months. That literally just passed. If you're asking the American public, what do you rate this president? What do you regard this president? And you get a preponderance of the American public, including a large number of Democrats, basically saying, yeah, he's not doing a great job. And even the majority basically saying, I hope he doesn't run again. That's not on them. That's on your president. What are your thoughts?
Super embarrassing, but can I explore one off-the-wall idea that just came to mind?
Go for it.
But that does, I don't know. I like to explore different ways of looking at things. And we talk about this enough that I feel like we have time to occasionally go into, okay, let's try this perspective on.
Yeah.
Let me put on this pair of glasses or whatever. One way of looking at this, and it's favorable for Biden and the Democrats on my behalf, I guess, is what if Americans just have a weirdly short attention span, like a lot of people have these days?
They do.
And it's gotten shorter over the years, and with Trump, it's like the series of a TV show that's really action-packed, and then you go into one where it's a lot slower, and the slower one naturally seems boring and starts to lose people, and people are like, "This show sucks." You know, that's when it starts to turn with some people with any given TV show. Anyway, you get where I'm going with this.
It's like
Biden,
we need more things going on.
With Biden, what the heck is going on? And you can make this, of course, the point that we always make, which is what's he actually producing? What productivity? What's he getting done? Progress. What progress has he made on his agenda? You can go with that angle, but also literally in terms of how much noise has his administration generated compared to Trump's administration, which was a hornet's nest that the media was constantly attacking. It was like this, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stuff going on constantly with all the rollout of these stories. With Biden, there really isn't anything. And what that set of conditions led to under Trump was polarized support and animosity towards him, where you had people who were like, this guy's great, and he's being attacked by this witch-hunty Schiff establishment, Russiagate, Miller crew.
Yeah.
And then you had the other side that was like, this guy is a tyrant, and he's evil, and he's a white supremacist racist who, if we allow this kind of thing, is gonna bring America to the hilt of an incredibly scary fascist ethno-state. And there were people, and I can get where each one's coming from. I don't ascribe to either of those points of view, obviously. But my point is that polarized people, which meant it was exciting and people felt engaged in it wherever you were. You know, even if you didn't really care about politics, you knew, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on right now. It's crazy. Yeah. What the heck, guys?
You're thinking the frenetic energy
and
died
then
away
going
down to like a lower level.
There's
People,
nothing with
it's
Biden.
not as engaged.
No, there's literally nothing with Biden. The media is not attacking him. He's not having to defend himself. The most exciting thing that we heard about Jamarl was Kamala and Biden's staff fighting with each other.
Yeah.
Indirectly.
Yeah.
That's the most exciting bit of drama. Think about it. I'm not kidding. From inside the administration so far this year, am I wrong on that?
You're thinking that pageantry was one of those things that kind of like bread and circus. And in this case,
exactly.
Circus of it all is the thing that kept people engaged.
Yeah, it keeps people engaged.
Even if they hated Trump and everything else.
Exactly.
But with us, they're like, well, we don't see that much action.
Yeah.
And because we don't see that much action, we're attributing that to nothing getting done.
And what people
we don't particularly like it.
What people realize, people think we want stability and we think we want to return to normalcy, but actually we're schizophrenic and people also want all action all the time because we like it. And we're weird that way. And we thought we wanted stability under Biden, but it turns out stability is actually kind of boring because under stability, under peace, not all that much actually happens. It's kind of comfortable. Yeah. But we're not used to it. We're in a mode. I don't know. I'm not saying that's the right way of looking at things. I'm throwing that in as a perspective that I hadn't necessarily heard before. And it seems like a valid one to me.
Yeah. I don't hate it. I mean, I do think a lot of this has to do with him not accomplishing much. I think it's that part. But look, it is true that under Trump, you had a huge amount of frenetic energy. I mean, like, whether it was because he was attacked on everything that he said, didn't matter what it was. He was attacked as soon as he came in. Then you had the Russia investigation. So that basically was this kind of drama that kept people glued to Rachel Maddow, telling them lies over and over again about Russia and the United States and all this other stuff. I mean, even when you had this kind of, turn of the worm, it still wasn't all that much acknowledged that these guys have been lying for the last several years. Meaning there was this kind of Tom Clancy-esque style to the White House under Trump that is just not necessarily there under Biden.
Yeah.
And so I can kind of see how one would keep people engaged as opposed to the other. But I don't know. I think for me, it would be more in line with people. I mean, I guess the question is did people choose Biden because they wanted less chaos? Because they wanted to not have that level of frenetic energy in the White House? And if so, then it may just be, what is he doing? He seems out of touch. Mm-hmm. And I think I put more on, he seems so out of touch. He seems so frail. He seems so unable to basically get the basic things done. He's not doing what he said he was. I think it's that kind of litany of charges of just incompetence.
Well, and here's another thing with all those. You're switching perspectives for a second because I wanted to throw that out there. But switching for a second, compare that to Trump. Everything that you're saying, compare to Trump for a second. I think there's this maybe shadow recognition among Trump's haters and Biden's supporters that Biden, despite what a lot of people like about him, lacks a lot of Trump's more vigorous qualities.
To put it mildly,
used the word frail. He used a couple other things, and with every one of those, I was like, yep, exact opposite of Trump. Yeah. Trump, not out of touch necessarily. In terms of being able to develop a base out of nowhere, creating the Trump base, which it hadn't existed as a political thing.
And hasn't gone anywhere.
You get there by being in touch. He was very clearly in touch with those people in some way. I'm not saying, take that as far as you want, but people would talk about his instincts politically in terms of managing the message, managing his message, saying things to keep people's attention, keeping the crowd interested, the entertainer personality, all that stuff coming together. Clearly very in touch. Frail, clearly not frail when it comes to fighting regularly, literally in a high profile way, getting COVID and then recovering within a couple of weeks. My point is, thing after thing, there's a weird polarity where Biden's on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. And maybe Biden supporters even kind of realize it on some level, even if they don't want to. But that's murkier, admittedly. That's psychoanalysis again.
I mean, considering you had, 48% of Democrats saying, I thought he was going to do a better job than this. I mean, maybe. I mean, if you have your own party or your own team saying that. I mean, and even from the standpoint of support, didn't he go from, I think, 3% of Democrats not supporting to like 18%? Like, the numbers spiked. Like, it went from, I think at one point Biden had like a 90-something% approval from Democrats. And that number has dropped to like 80%. I mean, so he is not doing well. And for whatever reason, Joy and Reid is just in oblivion. I don't understand. It's like, what don't you understand? I mean, whether it's the lack of energy, as you're saying, the lack of getting things done, or for that matter, just the lack of palace intrigue from the standpoint of media and energy and this kind of frenetic White House, whatever that reason is,
And
she is in the dark.
all of the
and I don't
above.
know why she's in the dark.
All of the above. I'm not trying to bring up these other things as if they're like mutually explanatory. I mean,
No, they're not mutually exclusive.
mutually
All of it fits
exclusively
together,
explanatory. Exactly. Yeah, I think it fits together. And my point in bringing them up isn't to be that these are more important factors than the ones that you raise and we talk about. It's that we talk about those other ones pretty consistently.
Yeah.
And so, throwing these other ideas in there too. But no, I think it's all that. I think people look at the administration, they don't see it getting anything done, frankly, and they're kind of bored with it. They can tell that there's no sign that there's something about to happen.
Yeah.
With it, and COVID's not going away.
And by the
Inflation's
way,
rising.
It's
There's this calm before the storm thing right now, I feel.
right. And next month, all sorts of stuff is still going to have to get done. You still have the budget resolution thing that has to get, not the budget resolution, the debt ceiling that's still looming in December.
Yep.
And it's unclear how they're going to get that passed. You still have the budget that needs to get done, meaning
Back
you have
better.
to keep the government from shutting down.
Oh, that.
And
yeah,
you even have, what is the National Defense Authorization Act, that's supposed to be passed, but, that typically gets passed with a whim. Nobody really thinks too much about that. But the other two are huge. And either of those, meaning however bad you think Biden's White House is and the United States is under Biden, it can get worse. And it may get worse just in 1 month. We'll see.
It's true. We'll see. We'll see about that. Let's go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into a break, coming back in just a minute. Be right back.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the report.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station from Washington, D.C. So we're trying to bring on a guest, and we're having difficulty getting this guest in. So I want to go to a different story. Jen Psaki was having a conversation the other day, clearly at the White House podium. She's the press secretary for Joe Biden. And of course, one of the main issues that have been availing the American public has been inflation. 6.1% inflation is the largest since 1990, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, people are going to look to the president and ask him, what are you going to do? Some people go as far as basically saying it's Biden's fault for the year that he's been in office. Whether it's his fault or not, whether this stops at him or not, the buck does stop with the president. He's the guy who's in charge. He's the guy who people are looking forward to. And he's the person who's going to have to come up with some way of dealing with it, or at the very least, explaining it. Now, I played the clip yesterday with Stephanie Rule on MSNBC, anchor or host, basically making the point that, yeah, this is going to be here to stay and people should be okay with it because people got all of this money and they have stocks and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Missing the point that the people at the low end of the totem pole who are getting hit by that inflation, it's like a tax. It's like an extra tax. And it's not just on things that they don't necessarily need that you can just do away with. You have gas going up 59%. You have various meats and various food items going up 6-7%. And if you're on somewhat of a fixed income, or if you're on an income that is somewhat inflexible just because you don't necessarily make all that much, you take it in the teeth. It bites. It eats into you, especially if you're a single parent, if you have kids or whatever else. It bites. So in the rhetoric that is taking place in the White House now, a thing that's been added to the bipartisan infrastructure bill and even the BBB bill is it helps with inflation. It's going to help with inflation. Pass my bill because it's going to help with inflation. Let's hear Jen Psaki. She's asked about this inflation issue. Listen to what she says yesterday. Let's play the clip.
I brought finally, on the state of America right now, inflation obviously at a 31-year high right now. Americans are seeing their dollars, their paychecks stretched right now. Why should Americans not be concerned that injecting another $1.75 trillion or more would further raise inflation?
Because no economist out there is projecting that this will have a negative impact on inflation. And actually, what it will help do is will help increase economic productivity. It will help economic growth in this country. That and the Build Back Better agenda will help reduce inflation, will help cut costs for the American people over the long term.
But as you acknowledge, that's over the long term. So I guess for those Americans who are really struggling with the bottom line right now, what is the president doing now, like immediately, to try to directly impact the rising costs that Americans are witnessing?
Well, the number one thing that the president can do is help get COVID under control. That we know is the root cause of inflation and the price increases we're seeing for a range of reasons. That is the best step that he can take, that the administration can take to help get it under control. I'd also note, though, in many of his proposals, but his Build Back Better agenda that is currently working its way through Congress, and we're eager for the House to pass this week, there are a number of components in there that will lower costs next year for the American people, cutting child care costs in half, making preschool free for families starting in 2022, saving families $8,600, leading to the construction of additional housing units. We're seeing housing and the cost of rent as a major driver of costs for families across the country. And even on issues like negotiating prescription drugs, there are people across the country that are paying a lot of money out of pocket for insulin. It will cap the cost at $35. The president has a plan for lowering costs for the American people. No one is denying that inflation and any element of raising costs is an issue for the American people. The question is, what are the solutions? We're proposing solutions. In the short term, we have to continue to get COVID under control. In the medium and long term, we want to pass this agenda, which economists will tell you, including Nobel laureates, this will help address inflationary issues over the long term. Go ahead.
All right. So Jen is saying a few things there. She's trying to defend her boss, of course, and the issue of inflation comes up. And she basically makes the point of saying that the guy asked the basic question, look, is the $1.75 trillion or the $1 billion stimulus infrastructure plan that you just passed going to have some effect on inflation? Why is that not going to make it worse if indeed it's already at 6% and depending upon what it is? And her point was that basically nobody in economics have said that it would adversely affect it, that this will affect productivity, increase productivity, that it'll cut inflation. Again, she didn't necessarily explain how it would cut inflation. But it seems that what she's leaning on is this notion that it's going to cut costs. And because it's going to cut costs, you're not going to feel the inflation in a way that you would typically feel it if those costs were still there. But that's not really cutting inflation, if that makes sense. It's yes, you're giving people jobs. And yes, you're cutting people's costs either in regards to childcare or something to that effect. But that's not the same thing as cutting inflation, if that makes sense. I don't necessarily see how this plan, even if I can believe, okay, because you're adding certain things to help people out financially, that you're going to bring down that cost. Fair enough. How does that stop inflation? I don't see that part. Even if you give people jobs, I don't necessarily see how that stops or cuts down on inflation. And by her own estimate, this is not something that's going anytime soon. Like, it's not. When she first answered this, it came across as if, well, the president's plan is going to deal with that. And then as the guy kind of pushed her on it, it became clear that, no, this is for something in the foreseeable future where later something is going to happen, but the president is going to try to mitigate the damages of inflation. I don't know. That sounds a little dicey to me. Sounds like she's saying two things. What are your thoughts?
A couple things. A bunch of stuff comes to mind. For one thing, we have a caller, and so I'll try to be relatively brief here. But there were things that came to mind, and then I want to come back, just listening to her talking, and then I want to come back to paying for pre-K childcare, preschool childcare. Jen Psaki, for one thing, good to hear that she's recovered from COVID. For another thing, she didn't answer the second question, obviously, about what Biden's doing. Well, maybe not obviously. If you listen to it, the person asked, and I will paraphrase, basically, he's asking, obviously,
is the 1.75 trillion
is the 1.75 trillion? Is it? But it's not just that. It's going to what Biden's doing. Sorry, I'll go to another point because there was something that I had as a note that's, as I'm rereading it, slightly making less sense to me. Anyway,
well,
she flat out
saying,
lied.
What is he going to do about inflation, and is the 1.75 going to make it worse?
That's kind of where he was going with the first question. And she flat out lied when she answered that one. She said that no economists predict that this will aggravate inflation, that it will make inflation worse. That was, we're going to be talking to Mark Frost, and we probably will sometime soon. Basically,
he doesn't buy that.
That's a flat out lie.
Yeah,
she's saying no economists we've talked to them. He's an economist. Economics professor, and has worked in the space. We talked to others. Of course, they predicted it. Richard Wolff, we've had on. He's talked about this.
Yeah.
You know, some people might debate. We've had debates, admittedly with non-economists, but recent debates about, whether inflation is good or bad. But the idea that inflation is happening is undeniable, of course. Now, what she's saying is this is not going to lead to bad inflation. But you can find economists by the dozen pretty conveniently. I can locate some in a couple of seconds of Google searching right now. I know them who are saying this will lead to bad inflation. How bad is up for debate? But that's an outright lie.
Like the economists that we talked to didn't,
that's probably your frame of reference.
It's probably that, it's like the four that we had in the room with us.
And then here was my other point. The guy had been asking her, because she had asked him that stuff, or he had asked her that stuff in the first question. In the second question, he basically asked her, what is Biden doing about this?
Right.
What is Biden doing about inflation? And she didn't answer that. She answered what Biden could or should be doing, which is solving COVID. But if you literally go back and listen to it, and then she got into the Build Back Better plan and started puffing up the bill as this thing to pass. But she didn't answer the first question. She lied to, very clearly. The second question she didn't answer. She answered with another question, which is intentional. She's skilled enough. She's put in that position for a reason, which is to lie to people and to talk on her feet effectively. I'm to that point with her.
She doesn't want to hit that straight up.
For some reason, this is hitting me. This is really pissing me off because because it's such an egregious lie. The first one is such an egregious lie. No economists?
Yeah.
Anyway.
No economists. I mean, you're going to find some people who are even flat earthers. Meaning, nobody is ever going to say, of course there's going to be some people who say that.
It's that logical, I admit, the hard case is, yes, there's that logical argument. But here's the thing. It's obvious that there are economists who think they're just contrasting views on this stuff. She would know that, of course.
Some right-wing economists
obvious.
who think this is horrendous.
Exactly.
The government shouldn't be spending
now,
this
you
much
can disagree
money,
with
etc.
them,
Yeah.
but she's just lying by saying that. Now, we got a couple callers. I failed at being brief, but only one more point, I promise. With the pre-K education stuff, part of what I see happening here is, think about it, during COVID, a bunch of people start homeschooling because they're working from home.
Right.
That means, and some people quit their jobs. We talked about this with Mark Frost for a long time. Suddenly, people have money in the savings accounts, money invested in retirement. They're making money. They're working from home. Maybe one of the spouses, husband or wife, whichever, decides, hey, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to stay home with the kids. They're schooling from home. Let's make this homeschooling thing. Let's give this a try. The government sees that, sees the labor force participation rate going down, sees less people working, and sees more kids out of schools and thinks, hey, we need to make it easier for parents to get back to work.
Yeah.
These parents are making this decision because maybe it's cheaper for them, even though, you're losing out on an income, but at least you don't have to pay for expenses with school. It's cheaper in a lot of ways. As many parents who decide to homeschool now, even though you're missing out on that income, you save a lot of money. So parents are making that economic decision, and the government looking at this is probably thinking, hey, we need to get these people back out into the workforce to get GDP up again. Let's make it cheaper for them to send their kids to school so they won't pursue that strategy. In other words, the government, looking and seeing the way the wind was blowing with this homeschooling thing on the rise during COVID, decides to counteract that because they want GDP on the rise instead.
Yeah.
They want more people working. And so they're like, okay, let's make it easier for people to put their kids in school.
What
which
was the number
I'm
of people
opposed to
that
personally. But
moved to homeschooling from traditional schooling?
I think that's part of what you need to look to back up my point here and to actually make it a case, a paper, for instance, could be written about, because there is something here. But
so you really don't know the number of people or if there's been a jump in the number of people.
No, of course not. But I've heard, what I've heard consistently is that homeschooling has been on the rise, as probably have you.
No, I haven't.
Oh, you haven't? Yeah, no, talking with my dad about that, I think talking with Mark Frost about that, and then just online, it's all over the place. But no, I don't know the exact numbers.
Okay. I don't know, man. I mean, for me, the pre-K thing has been something that they've been trying to do for a while, or at the very least has been something that's been bounced around Democratic politics for a good time. They do want people back to work, so there's that part. That's a definite. And just from the standpoint of administration, of course they want their numbers higher. Like, of course they want their participation and everything else in the workforce higher.
Yeah. But labor force participation rate, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it makes their numbers look good and everything else. But I don't necessarily know if the government is overtly looking at the number of people who decided to stay home and then say, okay, well, we're going to pass this policy because we're trying to get people back.
Fair.
I get the feeling that it's more so just a policy that they wanted. But, I mean, I agree with you on the front that they do want those numbers higher. And I would imagine they felt some kind of way when all those people start quitting their jobs, when they start getting this kind of new lease on life in regards to what they wanted to do.
That's where my mind goes with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have callers, though.
Yeah, go for it.
Let's go to John, calling in from Pennsylvania. 202-521-1320 is the phone number, by the way. John, what's on your mind?
It's Sean, but that's all right.
Oh, Sean, pardon me. Sean, what's on your mind, man?
This Rittenhouse case brings me back to a story that Jamarl brought my attention to, that The Intercept came out with. A couple years ago, there was a Cuban national who was convinced by the FBI to try and set off a bomb in public, and he ended up not going through with it. But I'm pretty sure he's still sitting in prison. And the whole thing, like, I just personally want somebody looking into all these shooters and who they were in contact with online. Because that Rittenhouse thing, the kid looked like John Wick with a rifle out there.
You're feeling like it's a psyop or something like that.
Yeah, I'm really feeling like it's a psyop. It just seemed like it was set up too perfect.
I don't think it was. I
don't think it was either, but I'm open to the idea of those kinds of things being true, so I'm not going to shoot it down in a way that a lot of people
possible
would. But,
that,
I don't see anything in this particular case.
I don't see it. I mean, you get all sorts of riots. You get all sorts of people protesting and marching. And you have some places where this gets intense, where it's intensified. And you have, let's be honest, this became racial at the very basis of it because of George Floyd and Chauvin basically murdering Floyd and all of these people marching and everything else. And then on top of that, you get people saying, hey, they're trashing those businesses, especially if you're a right-winger. You're looking at this saying, this is horrible. It becomes political, overtly so. And you get this kid who basically wants to play soldier, gets a weapon and goes across the border. Now, whether that's because he has family there, whether because he has, it's close to him and he has some kind of ties to that particular community, whatever the reason, he decides he wants to go there. But you can see the incentives built into it. Like, I don't think it's one of those things where it's like, wow, why did this happen? You can see, whatever you think of Rittenhouse, how one stone led to the next stone for him to kind of take that action. I'm skeptical of the psyop point on this one.
Thank you for that, though, John.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. And pardon me, Sean. I said John again. Sean. Let's go to Brave, calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, good morning, guys. Hope you guys can hear me clearly.
Yes.
No disrespect to Sean at all. All due respect, as a matter of fact. But I think that this brother, I would say to you that the psyop, you have your scopes in the wrong direction as far as the psyop. The psyop has been the media coverage of it, and the way they've manipulated everyone as far as our perception of that particular case. And I was actually calling in to comment on Jamarl's monologue concerning Joy Reid, just to say that Joy Reid's political commentary, in my opinion, I'm sure you guys' opinion too, it's just hot garbage. I probably can't say that, but I can say it. It's hot garbage, man. She ain't never really been worth nothing concerning that stuff. But I think Sean's call on the Kyle Rittenhouse thing is more interesting. First of all, I really believe that Kyle Rittenhouse, and I'm saying this as a black man who was down for the Black Lives Matter protest and even some of the rioting, as a matter of fact, I'll be quite honest, right? And even some of the January 6th stuff, because I'm cool with the burning, right? But I look at what they're doing to Kyle Rittenhouse. I look at how they've covered Ashley Babbitt, who was shot at the January 6th thing, and even other cases, how they cover young black men who get arrested or killed, or in cases, and it's always just a constant barrage of manipulation. How is Kyle Rittenhouse situation, other than George Floyd riots going on at the time or protests going on at the time, how does it have anything to do with race? You know what I'm saying? But I've got people around me who are dear to me who are calling him a Nazi and a skinhead, and it's just ridiculous. So I would say the psyop is more so the coverage. If there is a psyop indeed, I would say it's more so along the coverage of the Kyle Rittenhouse case.
I would say it's the constant psyop. The media is how that works. But Jamarl, what do you think?
Yeah, the media is a constant psyop. I mean, if you look at the Ethiopia issue, for example, I mean, appalling, just completely appalling in the way they've covered that story. I mean, even the Biden and Russia thing saw with my own eyes, where they were asking Biden's questions in this kind of adversarial way just because he's trying to make some kind of peace deal.
But also brave. I'm pretty sure you'd agree with that. I don't mean to one-up you and be like...
You mean the Kyle Rittenhouse?
Just in general, that the media is like that. I don't mean to be like,
just like
well, no, actually, it's everywhere. The whole media is like that. I'm pretty sure you agree with that. I don't mean to...
Yeah, they seem to go along with a very specific narrative on all sorts of stories. Reality seemed to matter less.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Cable news is just horrible. It's just horrible. And they seem to spin the narrative or go along with the narrative. And I don't even think we can tell anymore where intelligence agencies,
Yeah, where one begins and the other ends.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
No, you can't. And that's been the whole thing with Mockingbird. Man, I remember first hearing about that crazy working out in South Dakota. My dad, working with him journalistically, like a retired Army colonel had just given us a gun for self-protection because we were pursuing a case against the Attorney General, not a legal case, but a journalistic case against the Attorney General of South Dakota. Crazy time in my life. Never had to use the gun for self-protection. I'm pretty sure that dude was a bit paranoid.
Yeah.
But same
never
guy.
know.
Never know. Literally, same evening, he hands us a pistol. He's telling us about Project Mockingbird, and I was like, I was a little bit incredulous, but naive,
that was real.
However, 23-year-old or something. I was like a 22-year-old, or 1-year-old, something. I was like, I'll look into this. Went back home, looked into it, and it's real. The CIA did try to influence, the American media, and there's no real sign that it ever ended, and no incentive for it to end. No, super real. Anyway,
I mean, if you look at the number of CIA agents at this point that are just on mainstream media. Not to mention you have a situation where an agent will have sources in media where they were, take the story. Now, the story is entirely because they want to get the story out there for some kind of reason, political intelligence or otherwise. But they have those connections. They do that stuff. Anonymous source said this. Okay, what anonymous source? Who's the person? And why did that person give you this particular information? Is it a leak or is it something where they basically just want you to put it out in the public? Oftentimes, it's no way to know.
No.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have voiced up to that in the last 5 or so years specifically. Yeah. There's been this interesting thing with the clearing of the swamp where, and Assange is part of it, clearly Snowden, I would argue, 2012, 2013. There's been a wave of revelations since then and just people shifting. And it's not saturated the whole public. It's not like everybody distrusts the CIA, but the lefties have for a long time.
Yeah.
Democrats turn in favor of intel agencies in various ways is weird to me. But my point is, I think everybody's aware of it.
They just did so because of Trump.
Yes.
That's the only reason.
It's true. Let's go to Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
Thanks for taking my call. First, I'd like to say free Julian Science, free Dunzinger, and hands off Haiti. My first comment, I have 2 comments. First comment is dealing with the high inflation that's going on with you got truck drivers getting paid 40 cents, maybe 40 cents a mile. And the gas, these big old trucks only giving 4 to 5 miles per gallon. So that's not even adding up to the $3 per gallon they have to pay. They're actually going under. That's why you got 75,000 truck drivers missing, And my second comment is dealing with the war hawks do not like what Joe Biden sitting down talking with the Chinese, talking about, ignoring the Taiwan crisis. Joe Biden might be a war hawk, but he's not a super war hawk. If y'all remember 2 months ago, I brought up the infighting going on between the Joe Biden camp with the Kamala Harris camp 2 months ago when I was listening to the Duran. And now it's coming to a head now where you got people like Roland Martin sending out tweets and this one and that one sending out tweets talking about losing the black vote or whatnot. But the thing is now is they're up and fighting. I'm glad y'all brought it up yesterday. But
what's ludicrous? I mean, like Kamala Harris is basically trying to say that, through her acolytes, through the people who are on her staff and everything else, that Biden is being racist. That's basically where they're going with that. Oh, she's standing up beside that white man, Pete Buttigieg, but he wouldn't stand up for the sister. That's basically the argument that these guys are trying to make. I mean, they throw either race and sex into everything. Doesn't matter necessarily what it is. It has nothing to do with the fact that she was miserable and unlikable, even when she was running in the primary. It has nothing to do with the fact that Bernie Sanders had twice the black vote that she was getting, despite the fact that she's considered black. I mean, all of the stuff. It makes... They're basically trying to find a way to assuage or to get rid of blame on her. And yeah, good luck with that. Good luck with that. Tarif, thanks, my man.
Tarif, thanks for the call. Real quick, just if you've given out your info before, Tarif, often give us great stories. If anybody wants to follow Tarif, I know that he's public with stuff. Tarif Simon is his name. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be coming back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning's show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean, more likely than not, that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Molnupiravir. I struggle with that word. That's what I'm saying now. I'm getting it in my head.
Rhyming it.
Yeah. All right, guys, let's go into the headlines. Look, I really do dislike when people are using this notion of race or sex in order to absolve themselves of failure or absolve themselves of blame. Any honest person who's looking at Kamala Harris knew she wasn't popular even the first time around, knew she wasn't that liked the first time around. She couldn't even make it to Iowa. And, you know, the locking people in prison. I mean, after Tulsi Gabbard basically ate her alive in that debate in 60 seconds, basically, you kept people in prison longer than they were supposed to. You had people fighting fires for like 8 cents on the dollar, the locking up stoners, even the threatening a homeless mom with jail based on truancy of her kids. And again, the issue here is that she was homeless and then laughing her way through that. She's just an unlikable person.
Talk about out of touch.
Yeah.
Remember when she went to when she went to France and she did the
accent,
imitation accent? I just imagine her in like middle America, just like, she meets me. And I've got this big beard right now and I look kind of weird. She just starts talking like in an Alabama accent. She seems out of touch. You can imagine her doing that kind of thing where she's trying to make the rounds in the States, but she just doesn't know people.
Yeah, doesn't make that connection. I mean, she just seems to be out of touch, and it shows. I mean, just in the way that people regard her and whatnot. She's somewhat awkward and stuff. That's not anything to do with race. That has everything to do with her just not doing a good job. But let's go to the headlines. In the news. Yesterday, in the United States, there were 89,966 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,414 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 85,861 cases per day, an increase of 18% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 69% of residents have now received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,275,212 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 764,592 men, women, and children in America. The United States plans to pay upwards of $5 billion to buy enough doses of Pfizer's anti-COVID-19 pill, Molnupiravir, to treat up to 10 million people. Pfizer yesterday applied the emergency authorization of the drug with the FDA. The treatment is taken a regimen of 30 pills over the course of 5 days. In national news, jurors weighing charges against Kyle Rittenhouse are to return for a second day of deliberations. If convicted, Rittenhouse will face life in prison for killing 2 men and wounding a third with an assault rifle. The case went to the anonymous jury after the judge, in an unusual move, allowed Rittenhouse himself to reach into a raffle drum and draw numbered slips determining who will decide his fate. That task is usually performed by a court clerk, not the defendant on trial for murder. This judge is suspect, to put it mildly. I mean, whether it's not, I don't want to call these people victims despite the fact that they were basically killed and murdered by this guy. And even, yes, the prosecutor might have been making some mistakes where the judge has been yelling at him, but he seemed to have been very, let's say, a kind eye to right-wingers, and in this case, Rittenhouse. We'll see what becomes of it. In international news, suicide bombers have targeted the Ugandan capital, Kampala, killing at least 3 people and injuring over 30 others, and the number of dead is likely to rise. There's been a number of bomb explosions in recent weeks. Last month, a 20-year-old waitress was killed after a device in a shopping bag detonated in a bar in the city. Police believe bomb threats are still active. Belarusian authorities moved today to house migrants on the border with Poland in large red brick warehouses several hundred yards from the border crossing. Western officials have called the migrant crisis, quote, a hybrid war, unquote, waged by Belarusian President Lukashenko against the European Union as retaliation for their sanctions and for housing Belarusian political dissidents such as Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. The migrants, meanwhile, seem to be thankful simply to be indoors after weeks being spent outside on an increasingly cold border. Yeah, they don't have many supplies, and yet they're basically outside. President Biden said on Tuesday that he made it clear to China's Xi Jinping that his administration firmly stands behind the United States' long-standing One China policy. But he also noted that the self-ruled island of Taiwan ultimately makes its own decisions, later adding, quote, it's independent, it makes its own decisions, unquote. Those things seem like they're in conflict. Either he's standing by the One China policy, or they're not. Can't have it both ways. The suspect who was killed in a taxi explosion in the United Kingdom in the city of Liverpool is said to have spent at least 6 months preparing for an attack by buying components for the bomb. That is greatly unfortunate. In a story that we read the last hour, Cuomo may have to forfeit millions of earned money, basically dollars, from his pandemic memoir. The Joint Commission on Public Ethics accused Cuomo of essentially obtaining approval under false pretenses, including breaking his promise not to use state resources toward the completion of his memoir. Contrary to the representations made on behalf of Governor Cuomo and not disclosed to the commission, state property, resources, and personnel, including staff volunteers, were used in connection with preparation, writing, and publication of the book, according to the resolution that was approved by a 12-1 vote. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So yeah, this one is kind of interesting. If you remember, Andrew Cuomo got in trouble in New York for basically hiding the number of deaths, basically cutting those deaths by half and hiding numbers. And part of this had to do with decisions that he basically made, some of which basically sending people to nursing homes without getting those people tested and forbidding those people from getting tested, which clearly is a perfect storm. I mean, you're basically putting elderly or older people who have a high propensity to die from COVID into a situation where you can't even tell whether or not they have COVID. Whether it was the workers, whether it was the patients, a lot of those people basically died. Cuomo knew this. Cuomo hid those numbers as he was being basically attacked by Donald Trump for having such high numbers of death in New York. And after hiding the numbers, chest stumps about it, sits down, does these presentations week after week after week or day after day after day where I know better than the experts. I'm the adult in the room. I know what I'm doing. I'm Cuomo. Look how awesome I am compared to how calamitous Donald Trump is. Gets an Emmy for it. And you find out that all of that stuff was fraudulent. It was stuff that he just made up for all intents and purposes. So despite the fact that he got an Emmy, the Emmy was eventually taken away from him. There was questions on whether or not he could even be brought up on charges because it seemed like you were basically getting a book, basically financial gain for basically something of hiding those number of deaths. That never necessarily came to pass. But basically, Cuomo ends up losing his job for that. And then you add in the sexual harassment issue, you add in the anger management issue. Yeah, Cuomo is not necessarily doing all that great right now and is basically out of office as a result of his own actions. But in this very specific case, their point is not so much that he didn't earn the book because the book was basically full of it. Their concern is more so that he was using government resources in order to make that dodgy book. And as such, he may have to give that cash back. Very interesting. One of the other articles that recently came out that I thought was fascinating, this came out November 16th, and it makes the point that support for Black Lives Matter movement is declining, according to a new poll. 82% of the respondents in support of Black Lives Matter in the most recent poll were Black. Well, when you get into whites, that number drops. It says it peaked in June 2020 at 52% right after Floyd had been killed. At this point, the numbers have basically started to tick downward. Now, this gets interesting because we had the story yesterday about the case that took place between Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, going and having this kind of back and forth with the Black Lives Matter group in New York that, again, is not entirely affiliated with the main organization around the nation, but still goes by the moniker of BLM. In this very specific case, they basically made the point, despite the crime rate going up in New York, I think it's like a 20% increase, that if you go back to business as usual, or if you bring back this particular organization to deal with gun violence and everything else, that there's going to be blood in the streets. Quote, blood in the streets. You can imagine that doesn't necessarily sound all that good. We were questioning whether or not Adams contacted this guy because he was looking for that bombastic reaction in order to politically maneuver around it. Meaning, here's my opposition. Here's what this person is saying, blood in the streets, despite the fact that the crime rate is already through the roof. I mean, we don't know. It's unclear whether or not they're playing this level of politics. But I would tell you this. If you have a situation where crime is spiking and the public recognizes that crime is spiking and they don't like the fact that crime is spiking, and your argument is we still need to defund the police, you're not going to win that argument. You're not going to win that argument. And I suspect part of the problem associated with the reason why their numbers are probably going down, if I had to guess, probably has to do with that. I mean, the key slogan that people were aware of for BLM was basically defund the police. And what happens when you go with that particular line of logic and your crime rate spikes? I'm not necessarily saying that it's a good thing that the way cops behave and everything else. I'm making the point that defund the police is not necessarily the most precise argument to make if you're really trying to get rid of police. That issue has more to do with poverty, where you can organically get rid of the cops, not necessarily this kind of heavy-handed approach to trying to do so. But nevertheless, I was reading a poll that Black Lives Matter, basically, the numbers have gone down in regards to support. It says, according to a national poll conducted by Civics, a nonpartisan online survey affiliated with the progressive media outlet Daily Kos, 44% of respondents say they oppose Black Lives Matter. Another 43% say they support it, while 11% say they need to support or oppose. At the high point in June, that number was 52%, so it's dropped about 10 points. I honestly would put that more so on this notion of the defund the police argument more than anything else. I mean, there's a chance that this number was always going to be transient, in which case you really needed to strike when the iron is hot to get whatever you're going to get out of that. And again, to me, I keep thinking the issue is poverty. The issue is poverty. Deal with the poverty thing. But they didn't do that. Nobody listened to me. They went to basically defund the police. And now you have this kind of weird situation where crime is on the increase. And even if you apply it, the crime is on the increase to COVID. It's almost doesn't matter. The American public is looking at that like, well, wait a minute. I want the cops. Especially, like I said, if Ted Raw would be on the show saying, yeah, we need cops in New York, and Ted Raw is the lefty's lefty, then you've lost that argument. You've lost that argument. So, now I was having this conversation talking about Eric Adams and whether or not he intentionally had a conversation with the BLM guy from New York in order to kind of use that guy as a pivot.
I mean, my idea.
Yeah, that was your idea.
That was my idea.
Yeah, basically use him as a pivot to go after. I think it's a fantastic idea. I mean, if he didn't think of it, he should be admonished for not thinking of it. Now, you made the point yesterday that you thought it was kind of underhanded. I didn't think it was underhanded. I think it's just politics.
Yeah, well, maybe. But again, this guy isn't with the official BLM network. Not that they would necessarily be much more organized in their response. They probably wouldn't be as aggressive, provocative. Yeah.
No, agreed. Which is why you go to that guy.
Which is why you go to that guy, because you want the inflammatory. But my point is, what they wouldn't be is actually organized in the sense of having like a meaningful answer to the question, okay, what do you mean by defund the police and what's that going to look like in practice?
Yeah.
Somebody in the chat room yesterday was recommending that we try to book this guest, Susan Woods. So watching some of her videos yesterday, later on in the day, Jack brought them up, producer for the show, my brother. We're watching that. And she was making these points, and it reminds me of a lot of stuff. They got money. The Black Lives Matter Global Network got a lot of money last year. Like $100 million is the big number that I'll go to, right? Mm-hmm. They did not know what to do with it. And you can hear it in the interview. Remember the scandal earlier this year with her homes, Patrisse Cullors' homes, and she was buying these expensive houses, and people were asking, where did that money come from? Did she said, this is the interview where she said she didn't receive it in a salary. Mm-hmm. But she was going through, I believe, with Mark Lamont Hill in this interview with him. Anyway, she's going through these different sides of it. And there's one point where she's talking about the money that they raised, and she says almost embarrassedly, with a little bit of shame or something, we were not fundraising. She says something like, we weren't fundraising for that money. When we got the money, we realized we had to do something with it. And so we decided, we looked into ways to get it to the people who needed it as quickly as possible. And so they funded all these different activist organizations. The point was, they weren't fundraising for it necessarily. They weren't expecting it, certainly. Yeah. I believe that. And they had no clue what to do with it. Now, where would I go with that? Where I'm going with that is, that shows that these people don't have a clear and sort of intelligent, competent political agenda. They wanted to get this message out there. Mm-hmm. And they were thinking in terms of message building, which is, I would think, one small component of a larger plan for what you're going to do in politics to get what you want done. And what you want done is not just to change the culture in some nebulous sense, but like, I want to make our police this. We got to change this. We got to get this law repealed. You know what I mean? There needs to be some concrete, whether it's a law that you want passed, a law that you want changed, some action you want taken, or an explicit political system. If you don't have any idea of what that stuff is, and you're just rabble-rousing because you feel like the narrative needs to change, then when push comes to shove and people ask you what your ideas actually are and what this is going to look like, and you don't have any good answers, you just, then you find yourself in a cul-de-sac politically with no forward movement, as far as I can tell. And they got a lot of money. Yeah. The three founders of these organizations, the organization they put forward, got a lot of money. As far as I can tell, and they were rightly criticized, they didn't know what to spend that money on, so they spent it on activism stuff, on like funding people to go and protest in different places, and funding, paying for hotel rooms and services, making sure those people get food, so that they're able to get out and do activism work to spread the message, to keep the message going, to keep the momentum going. What they don't do is give that money to like people in black communities who are facing eviction, or give that money, to start up a local community garden. These are examples Susan Woods was giving. All these things they could have done that are like, okay, those are investments. Those are real investments in communities. Even if they're small ones, it's like, that's going to make a difference for these people for decades. You know what I mean? That's what they could have done. And she was making these arguments, and whatever, for whatever it's worth, she's black herself. She was saying, it's not that she disagrees with the message. She was disagreeing with their approach on it. Yeah. And then you get Patrisse Cullors in that same interview defending how she's spending millions of dollars. Say for a second she didn't make that money from the BLM, from her direct work with this network. She just got it from her YouTube channel and book deal and all that stuff. The way that she's defending it is, well, people are attacking me for this, but guess what? I am investing in black communities, my black community, my family, my friends. That was literally her argument. She was making a completely straight face.
That's not a good argument.
And that's the kind of thing where that's what she's telling to herself. That's her internal talk. Yeah. It's like, people want to attack me for this, but guess what? You got to start somewhere. I'm going to start by investing in my family. I'm going to make sure I can kind of get where it goes, but it comes across horribly. Wait, you raised millions of dollars, and forget for a second what you're defending your personal choices, which whatever, you can do whatever you want to, by saying you're somehow investing in the black community by making sure your family has a mansion to live in, by making sure you are doing okay. It comes across horribly. So my point is, they didn't have a clear political agenda. Psychologically, it's clear they're out of touch. She's out of touch. That's not a good message to be making.
No, that's not a good message. I mean, honestly, if it had nothing to do with the fundraising, just say, this wasn't fundraised money. I got this from channel and et cetera. Yeah. Because at that point, you're not trying to, you're delinking this notion of fundraising versus what I'm spending the money on.
And you don't need to defend it at that point, really.
Yeah. It's for political message. I don't know. I mean, they do have... See, I think they do have a political message. I think the political message is just overshadowed by defund the police. Like when people see it, that's the main message. But they do have like booklets and pamphlets on the things that they want to get politically accomplished and everything else. There may be a secondary question of whether they knew how to go about doing it. But they definitely had, this kind of agenda and everything else. I don't know. I think I would have spent more money. I mean, it's subjective on some level, right? But I think I would have spent that money on political action in regards to not necessarily activism in a proper sense, but maybe, I guess, part of it could go to rents and those type of things that people are in need. But part of it, even into funding certain politicians or certain political movements. I mean, after all, like you said, the goal of this is to get certain laws changed or certain things done. And those things should be concrete and specific where you can say, okay, this was a failure or this was a success. And figuring out what you need to do, what you need to fund in order to get those things accomplished. They might not have expected the money. They probably were shocked that people were sending all of the money in. They probably was even shocked that they caught fire in the way that they caught fire. I don't think anybody expected that level of protests and uprising all across the United States, or for that matter, Australia, New Zealand, just, pretty much across the world. Yeah. They probably caught them off guard.
But then it's just a flash in the pan. I'm sad to say, it's just a cultural moment.
Yeah,
it's like people.
But that's why you strike where the iron is hot. It's transient.
But to do that, you got to have a competent political cast. You got to have a group of people who have an idea about what they're going to do, a good idea, who pursue it vigorously, and it has to be a clear idea. It can't just be spreading the message or shifting the narrative.
It has to go beyond that.
Whatever.
Yeah.
We got to go into a break though. Let's go into it. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be coming back in a minute with Jim Kavanaugh. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, or just so happen to find yourself in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Let's get into some domestic politics. Joe Biden, happy, excited that he was able to get past his bipartisan infrastructure bill. As we said before, the BBB is basically on the sideline. But I think the question becomes, is this going to do anything to improve his lot in his political space at this point or by next year? Next year being the midterms, and at this point, all sorts of calamities, be it inflation, be it the debt ceiling, be it the budget in and of itself, and his agenda, or in the overall sense of the word. Is this basically going to help Biden and change the perspective of the public towards Biden and his administration? That's the question, because that's the thing that basically matters. That's going to matter for whether or not he's going to be able to keep Congress, and that's going to matter for whether he's even going to be able to keep his job, or for that matter, the next Democrat that takes power. To have a conversation about what's taking place in domestic politics, we're joined with Jim Kavanaugh. Jim Kavanaugh is a leftist socialist writer whose analysis can be found at thepolemicist.net and in Counterpunch. He's also a frequent guest on By Any Means Necessary and The Critical Hour right here on Radio Sputnik. Jim, what's going on, my man? How you doing today?
Good. How are you guys?
So far, so good. Not doing too bad. Cold here, but otherwise, we're alive and kicking. So Biden has finally passed this bill. I think the last time we talked, the bill hadn't necessarily passed yet. So he was able to get this done a couple of days ago. What are your thoughts? Do you think this is this a new day for Biden? Like, is this a new dawn? Is this something? In fact, we have a clip for this. Let's play the clip first, and I'm going to get your take on what Biden said in this clip. Let's play it.
Today, we're finally getting this done. So my message to the American people is this: America's moving again, and your life is going to change for the better. This law is going to make high-speed internet affordable and available everywhere in America, urban, suburban, rural, and create jobs laying down those broadband lines. No parent should have to sit in the parking lot at a fast food restaurant again, just so their child can use the internet to do their homework. That's over. This law makes us the most significant investment in roads and bridges in the past 70 years. It makes the most significant investment in passenger rail in the past 50 years and in public transit ever. So what that means is you're going to be safer and you're going to get there faster. And we're going to have a whole hell of a lot less pollution in the air. The bipartisan law will modernize our ports, our airports, our freight rail to make it easier for companies to get goods to market, reduce supply chain bottlenecks as we're experiencing now, and lower cost for you and your family. And folks, When you see those projects starting in your hometowns, I want you to feel what I feel. Pride. Pride in what we can do together as the United States of America. Folks, you know, the same goes for my plan to build back better for the people. Getting folks back to work and reducing costs of things like child care, elder care, housing, health care, prescription drugs, and meeting the moment on climate change. I'm confident that the House will pass this bill, and then we're going to have to pass it in the Senate. And that's fully paid for. It will reduce the deficit over long term, according to leading economists in the world. And again, no one earning less than $400,000 will pay a single penny more in federal tax.
Jim, those are clearly good things, right? I mean, this was something that the public or the country needed. Infrastructure. I mean, the infrastructure is crumbling in America. But is this going to be one of those things that give him a new breath of fresh air in regards to the way the American public perceives him or his administration in general?
Well, for that to happen, it would have to have immediate discernible effects on people's lives. You know, he said, this is going to change your life. This is going to change your life. Well, people have to see that happening. Now, this infrastructure bill, you know, again, it's riddled with things. He talks about the broadband service. You know, they defined that in such a way that it was done, the original plan, which would have expanded public broadband service, was scrapped in favor of plans that cater to Verizon and cater to the private AT&T and the private internet service providers, and become like Obamacare for them. You know, subsidies for those for people buying service from those companies. So there's all this bill itself is riddled with a set of essentially, you know, privatization and asset swap. I forget exactly what they call it. Things that end up being privatization. It's clear that we need infrastructure. You know, the bridges are crumbling. The North Hudson train tunnel into New York City, into Penn Station, is crumbling, literally. And we need work on these things. That's been held up for a long time. So if insofar as the bill contains things that will start generating work on that, that'll be good. But I don't think those things are going to have a discernible, dramatic effect on people's social lives over the next 18 months, 2 years, to 2022, so the 2024. So, you know, I don't think this bill is not a dramatic thing. Whether he gets the other bill passed, and whether that is not going to be a terribly dramatic thing. It will give some child care support. It will give a bunch of things temporarily. But you have a whole ideology and discourse that's developing now, and an attitude that the Democrats are in disarray. They haven't been able to get anything done. Biden is confused. It seems like a ball of confusion. And I don't know how they're going to overcome that. And people's lives are not dramatically going to change for the social lives of ordinary working people for the better over the next 2 years without more dramatic programs that are directed directly to their social needs. Rent reduction, debt reduction, health care, than what's in any of these bills.
I like, by the way, the Temptations reference with ball of confusion there. That was a complete aside. Here's where my mind was. Here's where my mind goes with this stuff, Jim. Why didn't they get this done so much earlier? We can talk. You know, we're talking about the infrastructure bill, of course. Here, this just got passed. Why didn't they do this like 6 months ago? I mean, I get that they were debating over the other bill the entire time, but crucially, my point is, after you saw Manchin and Sinema and other senators in opposition earlier this year to the $15 minimum wage, and even in the early stages of deliberating over the Build Back Better plan, it seemed pretty clear that there was a disconnect, and that whichever one of the three sets of parties you want to look at broadly, whether you want to talk about the progressives, the squad, and the House mostly, or you want to talk about Manchin and Sinema, these two standouts opposing it, or you want to talk about Pelosi and Biden, the sort of Democrat insiders who ostensibly would be driving and coordinating things, those as the three parties, it seemed like in the calculus between them, they weren't going to be able to get this. And it took me a little while to realize that fact, but I would have assumed that they would have been there much earlier because, of course, you'd hope they're politicians. They're going to be astute political players. But Jamarl, I remember, of course, we were talking about this. It's like, how are they going to do this? What's their plan? It seemed like the odds were shrinking as time went on. Now, admittedly, at a certain point, they did, they passed the infrastructure bill without the Build Back Better plans. Maybe they just decided to cut bait. But my point is, it should have been predictable. And if it had been predictable earlier in the year, they could have got this passed that much earlier, had it as a success, and moved on. to other projects and maybe to greener pastures. Jim, what's your take on it?
Well, you know, they needed to present the idea that they were actually fighting for social spending bill, and that was a priority for them. And, you know, they want to hold the constituencies that need those services that what a real social spending bill would give. And the progressives were claiming, you know, they just capitulated on tying the bills together. So, you know, it's like $1,400 versus $2,000. Why didn't they run on, you know, they weren't going to get the $2,000. Why did they say they were? Because they needed to do that to get elected. I mean, you know, so they're not going to get the spending bill. They're not going to get anything like the social bill that they promised, which would have been $15 minimum wage, debt cancellation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're not going to get that anyway, but they had to promise it. And then as it was clear that was being chipped away at entirely, they had to look like they were fighting for something. So they were fighting for keeping the social spending bill tied to the infrastructure bill so that, you know, we're not just going to give them the infrastructure bill what they want, which is going to pour a lot of money into private companies. We want this. We're going to make them vote on the social spending bill too. And then they just capitulated on that. I mean, the Democrats do have a plan, which is say you're going to change people's lives and then sit back and watch and allow as it's whittled away by lobbyists who make sure it's not going to change people's life very much, and nothing will fundamentally change.
Well, see, that's the bad faith take, and that's kind of where I would go. That's my because it's not tinfoil hat stuff, but I use it self-jokingly as a pejorative. That's if I'm being a little bit more bad faithy here or whatever. That's, you know, they had it planned all along. They didn't see how it could get passed, but they wanted to run on it. They wanted to give the appearance of going for it. Jamarl, you and I got into the argument about whether that was what was going on or whether Biden, as you said, was actually in it to win it because he and Pelosi saw this as, you know, their thing, their moment to get their agenda through. You and I were going back and forth on that. Jim, you're sort of taking the more bad faith thing that I was raising almost as a devil's advocate position. But also I was open to the idea. But if we go with that, say we go with that for a second, that's clearly a losing strategy over enough iterations because you just demotivate your base. Exactly. And if I were to take that tack seriously, I would have to assume that Democrats who've been doing that repeatedly, that would be the assumption. They keep doing the same thing like a dog that can't learn new tricks. That's their tack. I'd have to take them for absolute fools. And I can't help but feel like there's something a little bit more complicated going on here. But Jim, do you think that's what it is? What do you think I'm missing?
But the problem is they have two bases. They have the donor base and they have the voter base. And the voter base, they want, you know, they need to hold or try and hold ordinary people, working class constituencies in their voter base. But that's not their main constituency is not that. I mean, we've seen this in the Princeton study. This is an oligarchy. The people that get the priorities they want into legislation and plans are the oligarchy, not the people.
Yeah. It's like what it's statistical noise, I think that study said, in regards to what the voters want.
Yeah. And, you know, look, if this is the point, everybody knows that you have this resistance in Congress from the Republicans. We know what their program is. Their program is to protect capital and to protect American exceptionalism. The Democrats are part of that too now. But I mean, just in terms of the domestic agenda, to protect the prerogatives of capital. So the Democrats pretend they're for something else, but they can't really be because their fundamental ideology is nothing should fundamentally change in terms of protecting the prerogatives of capital because they have good faith belief, perhaps a lot of them, that that's what the economy and social progress really depends on. If you were going to fight, you know, the blockage of the Republicans for these social programs, you'd have to go in fighting, knowing that, saying, look, we've got a certain number of people elected. We have X number of people in the Congress, but we still have to fight against this. And you'd be waging an ideological battle to explain your positions, Medicare for all, debt relief, why these things are necessary and how they work and why they're not going to hurt you and you're not going to pay for them and all of this stuff. You'd have to wage that battle consistently. But if you don't do that, you'll never overcome. And you have to fight then in the midterm. You can't go in saying, oh, we won the presidential, but we're going to lose the midterms because we always lose it. No, you have to go in and say, we're going to have to go in there and fight to win more and more and more. And we have to show you why that's important. But they are not committed to those things. The Democratic Party opposes social democratic programs.
I agree with you. I agree with most of that. In fact, I agree with the overwhelming majority of that. But I think I put more on incompetence on this particular one. I mean, when Biden first came in, he did seem to have this notion in his head of, we need to compete with China. And because we need to compete with China, we need to invest in, the infrastructure and everything else. We need to put money into the economy and into the country itself on these various items. He did seem to legitimately push for that. I mean, even getting, no, he's not for Medicare for all. Clearly wasn't for the $15 an hour minimum wage. But some of the other issues, I mean, the $3.5 trillion legitimately seemed like something that he wanted to get done, because in his head, this was the way that the United States compete with China, and there are not enough democracies around the world, and so the United States need to show that democracy can still work. Or do you disagree with that? I mean, I guess I lean more on the sides of incompetence, in the sense that they thought that because they had 98, 99% of Democrats on the same page in regards to that particular agenda, that of course they were going to be able to get the last two. And they weren't able to get those last two. And it seemed that they just kind of fell apart when they couldn't get the last two. I mean, do you see it that way, or do you just see it as, no, they just lied from jump? I mean, I take it as incompetence. What do you take it as? Lying or incompetence?
I think it's really, he said what he needed to get elected. And, people believe it in the moment. When he was trying to defeat Bernie Sanders and hold on to Bernie Sanders' constituency, he was saying things that, oh, this sounds great. Let's do this. I mean, the notion of lying is like a psychological thing in a sense that, I don't care what Biden's psychology was about this. Mm-hmm. He says what he needs to say to get elected because he thinks it's a good thing, because it's going to get him elected and it's a good thing and we should do these things, and I'm kind of notionally for them. But when he gets into the nitty-gritty of executing policies and fighting for policies, he's not really willing. We know that. We know what his politics are. We know what his 50 years of service are. And
well, to be fair, I mean, I didn't vote for Biden because I didn't think I thought he was lying. I mean, to be bluntly honest, I didn't necessarily think he was going to do it. It was after he got elected when he was pushing for a lot of this stuff. If you remember, when he was talking about $15 an hour minimum wage, that was after he was elected. He was basically having a speech about starvation wages and everything else. Even when he was pushing for the $3.5 trillion, again, this was after the election. He had already been beating Trump at that point. He didn't have a media that was attacking him on it. And he just kept saying, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do. We need to fight it, get art hockey and all this other stuff. I mean, it seemed like it would be a horrid idea to tell people, I want to get all of these things accomplished. I want to pass $3.5 trillion. And you go, 5 months not being able to get it accomplished with you just flailing in the public's eye? I mean, we can look at the polling now and see how that basically turned out. He's at like 38% in regards to polling. I mean, it's utterly atrocious. But a lot of that has to do with his inability to get that stuff done, which is why I don't believe he went into it lying about it. I just think he couldn't get it done. I think there's a difference in those things. I could be wrong.
A little bit like Trump saying, "I'm going to stop all the wars." He might have personally wanted to do it, but then he runs into the people who really control the state and the deep state. And Biden ran into the lobbyists, and he ran into all of these things that prevent you from doing those things, whatever he thought personally. And Biden is ultimately, as was Trump, comfortable with with that whatever elements of the deep state, or that is the lobbyists and thing. And he's not going to the public and saying, look at what's happening here. We need to fight these people consistently. He's not doing that. He's not promoting the political program and the political activism which would overturn those elements of the deep state which are preventing things from changing fundamentally, because he thinks that's the way things actually should run. You know what I'm saying? It's not whatever he thinks about any specific program. He thinks that fundamentally things are okay, and that we got to work with these lobbyists, and we got to So that's really, this is a structural thing that goes beyond, but affects whatever personal politicians' views there might be.
I get the idea of like sort of political complacency, and even a good faith Democrat going into it thinking, okay, political system, all these problems, I can only get so much, and they're sort of reduced to the lowest common denominator of whatever's possible. And I will also, of course, earlier in the 20th century and preceding that in American politics, you'd have grand ideological debates waged between the two parties defining, a lot of the last century, specifically the first half of the 20th century, but continuing on, pitted ideological arguments. And that seems to have shifted over time. And now we have this sort of fragmented space with culture warring going on and people switching political allegiances. There's not a clear idea. Trump's base and the Trump Republican Party is a new thing. And Democrats, as far as I can tell, the old Union left, the old anti-war left, as represented by the Democrats have disintegrated as sort of ideological unifying factor. So I see that. But there's another thing that comes to my mind too, which I'm curious about your take on, Jim, as an experienced political analyst, which is the impracticality of getting through sweeping legislative packages. Unless you have a real strong majority right now, with the way things are with the filibuster and these omnibus bills, any bill you get out is going to be a collection of compromises, just a bunch of different, okay, I get this, you get that. A lot of it happens behind closed doors as politicians negotiate, even without specifics, just the general scope of things. You know, what kinds of taxes are going to be added, those kinds of things. You're just generally debating this stuff. And it's a sort of marginal gain, marginal warring process that happens behind the scenes that, in other words, the politicians shouldn't be making sweeping political cases. That's just rabble-rousing because they're not going to get them through. And the real meat of the political process, which is, okay, let's bicker effectively over what exact package. I don't want to, bicker is not exactly right. But let's just debate over what exact compromises we're going to make in this big omnibus bill that we're going to get through. If that's the thing, then how would you engage the public in that process? Why would they even be trying to inform or bring the public into it? Because necessarily it's a behind closed doors thing they're having to do. And that might have changed all of the rhetoric on this. And Jim, what's your take on that idea?
Well, for the legislative process, you know, if it's out there by itself, working behind closed doors, as you say, yeah, it's always going to be like this. But, you know, what it has to become is the after effect, or it has to rest on a process of political mobilization on the ground that's already taken place. FDR was a capitalist who wanted to save capitalism, but he knew he had to do certain things to do that, and he was capable of pushing those things because there was a political and social movement. There were socialist and communist parties, socialist parties, union, working class movements in the country and in the world that were threatening capitalism. So he was able to use that and to get serious progressive programs through that didn't overthrow capitalism, but made real, you know, semi-social democratic process. And that's what happened in the social democratic countries of Europe, because they were threatened by working class movements. They were real movements they were riding on. So you don't have that movement here, as you say, what we have in culture wars, these fights over this and that, because the idea of a working class movement that understands what it's fighting for, and that does not preclude compromise. Then you go into the legislation. Give you an example: health care, Obamacare, the fight over Obamacare, over universal health care. You know, if Obama was a real progressive radical, you know, and run into resistance, well, and this was put forward by people I know in the Democratic Party. We can't have universal health care, but let's lower the Medicare age to 55. Okay, that's actually a more progressive thing than what he did, because what it does is it extends the public program and it encroaches more and more on the private industry and the private profit program, which are first of all, you know, the drivers of inflation. You want to talk about inflation? Nobody who opposes universal health care, single-payer health care, is worried about inflation. So, you know, but instead he went to, no, let's subsidize the private industry. So there are ways of compromising that there are, you know, there's a good article I used in my thing. There are non-reformist reforms, and then there are reformist reforms. There are reformist reforms, which is kind of what's going on in the infrastructure bill with I was talking about with the broadband thing, and then there are non-reformist reforms that don't get everything you want, but do push things and create more space for public universal programs and for empowering working class people in a way that's irreversible, even if it's not all you want. But you have to have had an educated movement that understands what's at stake in that and fights for it. And even if you don't get everything you want, then you get something which at least advances the power of the working class in society in a certain way, not something which is a set of subsidies to private industry that are there to precisely only to make sure that the companies remain profitable. So that's it's not a matter of compromise or not compromise or doing legislative things. It's a matter of whether you've built a movement that understands what it needs and what the principles it's working on are, and are capable of doing that. And this whole thing again about the budget and budget deficits and we got to pay for this. That's once you're in that game, you're dead, because you're going to be fighting over things that really are stupid and don't and will end up being regressive.
If I had to get you to make a prognostication, two things. the Build Back Better plan, whether or not it's going to get passed at all. I mean, it has still to get through Manchin, it has to get through many of these people who are basically using inflation as the new issue. And even Biden's...
Not a new issue.
Well, say it again?
Not a new issue. I get your idea, which is...
They're trying to basically say this is going to deal with inflation now.
Yeah, but people have been talking about inflation in relation to the amount of money being spent for years.
No,
and
that's true.
That's
the
caveat that I want to throw.
No, that's fair. That's fair. It is higher now, the 6.1%. But inflation is that's not right. Inflation is being used as a new issue to legitimize not voting for the bill.
Exactly.
Specifically Manchin.
Inexplicably, even though that argument could have been made by Manchin much
earlier.
Yeah, it
could have been made months ago.
But there's also the issue with the CBO score that they haven't specifically broken out, but line item by line item. Or just
it hasn't come out yet.
You know exactly how much it's going to cost, which is a prerequisite for them being able to pass it. And that seems to have been a long-lasting part of that debate.
Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, but I guess the question is, are they going to pass it? The first question, I mean, $1.75 trillion. And on top of that, if you had to guess, right here from where we are now, I'm going to get you on the scoreboard, the outcome of the next midterms and even the outcome of the next election, what would you go with that? I mean, let's say for the moment that Biden doesn't run. Who runs after Biden on this? I don't necessarily know who they have in their stall outside of Biden if Biden decides at the ripe age or whatever that he's not necessarily going to take it up. It doesn't seem Kamala Harris can carry the burden on this. It just seems like Democrats are in a hard way going forward. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Democrats are facing disaster. And, again, what you're saying about the CBO score and all having on inflation, they're down in this game, and they're never going to win that. If they pass a Build Back Better bill of some kind, it'll be really a half-ass of a half-ass of a half-ass bill that, we'll get the eighth of an ass bill going to pass. And they'll tout it as a great success, and we're changing everybody's lives. It's not going to change everybody's lives that much. They might, the best they might get is a program that's a temporary program that lasts through the election. But, the Republicans aren't stupid enough to allow that to happen either. So I don't know what they're going to do with this. And this deficit inflation thing is, if you don't see this here and they don't get over this, this is a disaster. And you cannot argue about it. The salt tax deduction. Mm-hmm. People don't understand what the difference is between the fact that states and local governments need tax revenue and the federal government doesn't. And none of this whole tax and revenue thing, people have to either, if you don't understand it and they don't start fighting about this and explaining it, they lose every battle. So that's one of the main things that's going to go in to lose that, because they're on the same side as the Republicans about inflation and deficits and debt. That's the greatest, we must stop having deficits. So they're in the game. And, debt ceiling. We have a fight over the debt ceiling. This is ridiculous. But they don't know how to explain, and they're not willing. But it's even worse because now they do. A lot of them know how to explain it, but they're just not willing to do it. They're afraid to do it. So that is one of the many things that's going to lead to the fact that they have no candidate that anybody has that comes across in any way as anything but opportunistic and supercilious and, phony. Buttigieg, Harris, Biden is a disaster.
By the way, do you think they're going to replace Harris? That was one of the questions that came up. I mean, Harris is at 28% in regards to her polling. There was just the article that came out where, she's not necessarily the happiest in the world, even going so far as to basically saying Biden is supporting Buttigieg because he's white and not supporting her intuitively, I suppose, because she's not. But there were questions about whether or not they were going to get rid of her because of how bad she was doing and how horrible the polling and everything else is. Do you think they're ever going to do that? Or is one of those things they're stuck with her?
I don't know how they could. I mean, it's going to be portrayed in these politics terms exactly as, oh, my God, they couldn't put up with a black woman. They're going to go for some white man instead. They're trapped in this, and I don't know what they can do about it. But, not that Buttigieg are going to do any better. I mean, there's nobody on the horizon because they're all kind of shallow opportunists, and it's obvious. So, I don't know what they can do in terms of finding a personality that's going to, the Republicans are going to run someone like, if Trump runs again, it'll be just the height of fuss, American fuss, but they could do it, and he might win. But I think the Republicans would do better with someone like DeSantis or someone who, who's got more of a little bit younger and got more of a presence. But, I just don't know.
But if DeSantis ran, Trump said he wouldn't tolerate that. Trump has basically said he wouldn't. He sees DeSantis as his guy. I'd have to go back for the exact quote, but he was like, no, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm not going to let him try to dethrone me.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Exactly. I mean, he's such a narcissist that he's going to destroy. I mean, that hurts the Republicans' chances, his narcissism, I think. But who knows at this point? The fact is, the Democrats, the issue for the Democrats with all this jockeying for where is their constituency going to go? Are they going to hold on to 90% of the black vote?
Here's the direct quote, Trump on DeSantis, Jim and Jamarl. I'd beat him like I would beat everyone else, quote unquote. So that's his
like a drum.
That's his edge on that one. Of course, you can see it. But go for it, Jim.
That's funny.
Anyway, he's going to, this is the question for the Democrats is can they hold on to their constituency? They need 90% of the black vote. They get 80% or 75%, they lose.
Yeah, the party's over at that point.
So that's what their problem is with the identity politics and Kamala Harris because the fact is they're losing that vote anyway, not necessarily to the Republicans, but to staying at home, voting with their feet, people voting with their feet.
Yeah.
And because they're not changing people's lives. Nothing is fundamentally changing.
Well, and I get this isn't what you mean by the black vote, but did you see in in Virginia, the Ethiopian swing?
Over 100,000 people?
100, yes. Yeah. I remember a couple 100,000, but let's go with 100,000 as the lower end. But yeah, over 100,000 voters switching from Democrats to Republicans. Did you see that?
No, I didn't see that particularly, but I know there have been swings in the Latino vote. And as I say, they don't have to go to the Latino votes are going to Republicans. And the only demographic group that Donald Trump did worse in 2020 was white males. Every other demographic group, black, Latino, men, women, he did better. So this is what's happening. And because these constituencies which have been taken for granted are not going to go along with this anymore. They're just going to say either, I like Trump because he's a tough guy, and, or I'll just stay home. He looks like he can get something done, that kind of rhetoric, because the other strong political ideologies that would motivate people aren't there. And as people have said, even black people are tired of a lot of the identity politics and wokeness, and they're not producing changes in their lives.
Well, and here's another way. We're over time, admittedly. Thank you for sticking with us for so long, Jem. But just briefly, here's another place I would go with this one. In terms of losing voters and making their case, I could just see the Democrats doubling down all the more strenuously, and it could get bad, man. I don't know what your stance is exactly on the January 6th thing, but the idea that they had Russiagate, that has completely died out. They tried to extend that runway with January 6th, and I don't know what's going to happen, but the feeling is there's going to be some big scandal that just ups the ante even more, because that's their strategy, right? Is concocting either out of nothing or out of not that much larger narratives about the Republicans as either stalking horses for foreign powers or domestic terrorists running amok in the streets. I could see them trying to do something else, and I'm kind of worried about that. Jim, just briefly, what's your take on that prospect?
Oh, I think they're definitely doing that. As you say, they're trying to do it with January 6th. It's not going to work. This is what they're doing with the pandemic and with vaccine mandates. And they're going to try and run on that. Oh, if you don't have a vaccine mandate, you're going to be killing everybody. This guy doesn't want to put a vaccine mandate. And that's going to be a mistake. It's going to be a big mistake. The pandemic was used as a fear-mongering tool. Russiagate was used as a fear-mongering tool.
There were 750,000 people that died. That's fear-mongering gets across this notion that, okay, they're trying to make people scared of something that they shouldn't be scared of. With 750,000 people dropping dead, I don't necessarily think that's a fear-monger thing. That just seems like a reality thing.
It's not just that, but I'll put it like this. If the debate pretty quickly becomes, oh, you're an anti-vaxxer because you're not getting a booster shot.
Yeah. Yeah, that gets dicey.
Then isn't that like dicey, just around the corner, that stage of the debate? And it's one of these things where it's going to be the MSM going crazy about some of this stuff, while a lot of people are like, wow, the MSM is really going crazy over this stuff. And I'm somewhere in the middle, but this is insane. I don't know. I could see it going that way. But yeah, on the other hand, Jim, totally, 760-something thousand people this morning have died. It's not just a fear-mongering tactic.
Yes, it is. Excuse me, because what we know about that figure is it's not true. The only thing we know for sure about that figure is it's not the number of people who died from COVID. And it's exactly that everybody accepts that when you guys are repeating it. That's a figure of the people who tested positive on a PCR test and died of something. That's what it's a figure of.
No. It's both more and less than that. Because if some of those people didn't even get tested, they died, and doctors associated it with COVID. So on the one hand, I could make my case sound weaker than it actually is. But on the other hand, in a lot of those cases, there's the whole thing with comorbidities and deaths. And I don't know exactly where you would take this argument, but I've heard, the VAERS one, the vaccine adverse event reporting system. And there are a couple different ways people would take it, Jim. But broadly, I disagree. I think most of those deaths it's fair to associate them with COVID-19.
Well, they only associate, I'm sorry, they could be more. The point is that they deliberately and systematically created figures that are not reliable. Okay, we don't know the answer to the question, probably never will, how many people died from COVID as opposed to with COVID. And it is just a fact that the CDC and the state agencies got up on television and said, anybody who has a positive PCR test and dies in the hospital or dies within X number of days will be called a death of COVID.
But Jim, this is one of those issues where I don't see anybody being happy with any decision the government takes. I'll put it like this. If broadly, all medical authorities in the United States had decided to do the opposite, where they would not label deaths as COVID-19 related deaths unless the people had they had a clear test, it was obviously that and just that. If they did that, then everybody would be accusing them of trying to artificially lower the numbers, because then you'd have all sorts of people who clearly died from COVID. It's just they also, they had cancer, they had diabetes, whatever. In a lot of these cases, they're not about to die. If you have type 2 diabetes, it's not like you're right about to die. If you get COVID, that could knock you out. My point is, people would be accusing them justifiably of artificially lowering, deflating, not inflating the count. I don't know what the right way to handle that is.
The right way to handle it is if you have a case of COVID, which means people are sick with COVID, that's a case of COVID. A positive PCR test is not a case of COVID. You have a positive PCR test, there should be no universe of scientific respectability in which someone who has a positive PCR test for COVID and gets killed with a gunshot wound or a suicide or a motor.
Agreed. But what I see people doing is acting as if that is the norm, as if that happens constantly. When it seems like that's the exception, that's like, okay, that's an exception, and everybody agrees that shouldn't happen. That's ridiculous. But it's not like that's what, that's a pretty marginal case.
A person has some kind of heart issue, they get COVID, there's some kind of inflation thing that takes place with COVID and the person dies. Well, the person died from COVID. The person was living perfectly fine with their heart ailment. It was the COVID that basically pushed them over the edge. I mean, this is kind of like the Derek Chauvin stuff. It was like, oh, well, George Floyd had all of these medical issues. It's like, yeah, but he was living perfectly fine and he put a knee on his throat. Well, COVID is basically the knee on the throat. I mean, from my standpoint.
For some people it is. But the whole point is there was no attempt. In fact, the opposite was made. There was no attempt to make those decisions rationally and scientifically. Autopsies were discouraged or prevented from happening. I mean, these are things you kind of precisely it was to promote fear. And the whole point is we don't know the answer to the question because they didn't want us to know the answer. They did want to promote fear about this. This is a disease that has a 0.27% infection fatality rate.
It depends on who you are.
Well, it depends on what and how effective you are. Originally, it was like, not 0.2, it was like 2%. And before that, it was like 12%. I remember seeing in some limited cases, when you have no idea how to treat it, it's extremely deadly. But then we learn how to treat it, and, that lowers it.
But they don't learn how to. They prevent people from treating it.
I agree. Here's the thing, man. On some of these cases, I completely agree with you. Like, I'm in a weird spot because I'm kind of in the middle ground. But I don't agree. What I don't agree with is the idea that this was generated, prefabricated as a fear-spreading tool. What I think is authorities responding to a crisis that they partially contributed to by their mishandling of it are like, yeah, we got to keep people afraid of this one because then they'll listen to us and do what we say. And they think they're trying to do it in their best interest, in our best interest. All the while, they're actually screwing themselves and us over by lying to us and suppressing information that contradicts their opinion. I can see all that stuff being true at the same time. I don't know. What's your last thoughts? Because we got to close.
I think it was used as a fear-mongering tool against Trump, and successfully. And I mean, it came up as something. I mean,
they were dismissing it. No, you got to go back and look. Back in February last year, The Democrats were dismissing it. I remember Nancy Pelosi out in the streets of San Francisco dancing during a Chinatown celebration, making fun of Trump, calling him a racist or playing up this virus from China, which he did do.
They were trying to argue that he was trying to get the vaccine too fast. And so maybe we can't trust the vaccine. They were even going.
They were going that, and then they've had to completely reverse. My point is, in the beginning, we've got to come back on this. We'll occasionally revisit this when we talk with you, Jim. Always good talking with you. My point is, originally it wasn't a fear-mongering thing. It was au contraire. Trump was making it a point, and they were kind of rejecting it. But Jim Kavanaugh, left socialist writer whose analysis and work can be found at thepolemicist.net. Also Counterpunch. You're listening on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in just a minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever-vigilant, last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, both of us together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning again, everybody. I hope you're all having a good one. It's just past 9 a.m. Eastern. It's November 17th, and it's time now for our last batch of headlines this morning. Let's start off as we normally do with COVID statistics. First up, yesterday in the United States, there were 89,966 new COVID cases reported. There were also 1,414 new deaths from COVID-19. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 85,861 cases per day. That's an increase of 18% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 69% of residents have now received at least one dose. That's up from 68% yesterday. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,275,212 people across the United States. It has killed 764,592 people here in the U.S. The United States plans to pay upwards of $5 billion to buy enough doses of Pfizer's anti-COVID-19 pill molnupiravir to treat up to 10 million people. Pfizer yesterday applied for emergency authorization of the drug with the FDA. The treatment is taken as a regimen of 30 pills over 5 days. In national news here in the States, jurors weighing charges against Kyle Rittenhouse are to return for a second day of deliberations. If convicted, Rittenhouse will face life in prison for killing 2 men and wounding a third with an assault rifle. The case went to the anonymous jury after the judge, in an unusual move, allowed Rittenhouse himself to reach into a raffle drum and draw numbered slips determining who will decide his fate. That task is usually performed by a court clerk, not the defendant. The House will vote Wednesday on a resolution that both censures Republican Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona and strips him of his 2 committee assignments. A revised proposal released by the House Rules Committee on Tuesday night outlined the Democrats will seek to remove him from the Committee on Oversight and Reform, as well as the House Committee on Natural Resources. Several vials labeled smallpox have been found at a vaccine research facility in Pennsylvania, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said yesterday. There is no indication that anyone has been exposed to the small number of frozen vials, quote unquote. That's according to the CDC saying that in a statement. Quote, the frozen vials labeled smallpox were incidentally discovered by a laboratory worker while cleaning out a freezer in a facility that conducts vaccine research in Pennsylvania. CDC, its administration partners, and law enforcement are investigating the matter, and the vials' contents appear intact, end quote. And again, that's according to the CDC. An Iowa man was convicted Tuesday of killing a man last year and leaving his body burning in a ditch. Stephen Vogel, 32 years old, strangled victim Michael Williams, 44, and then wrapped his body in duct tape before transporting the body to a rural area and setting it on fire. Testimony during the trial indicated Vogel told witnesses he killed Williams out of jealousy over a quote-unquote love triangle, including involving Vogel's girlfriend. And apparently it was like 2 other people. It was a couple of people, all of them white, who had like conspired. It's unclear whether conspired to kill or just to clean up the evidence after the guy got killed. But coincidentally or whatever, the guy that got killed was black. So that's another layer to this story. In international news, suicide bombers have targeted the Ugandan capital Kampala, killing at least 3 people and injuring over 30 others, and the number of dead is likely to rise. There have been a number of bomb explosions in recent weeks. Last month, a 20-year-old waitress was killed after a device in a shopping bag detonated in a bar in the city. Police believe bomb threats are still active. Belarusian authorities moved today to house migrants on their border with Poland in a large red brick warehouse several hundred yards from the border crossing. Western officials have called the migrant crisis a quote-unquote hybrid war waged by Belarus's President Lukashenko against the European Union as retaliation for their sanctions and for housing Belarusian political dissidents such as Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. The migrants, meanwhile, seem to be thankful simply to be indoors after weeks spent outside on the increasingly cold border. Lukashenko's government also announced the three-day closure of the gasoline pipeline, the Friendship gasoline pipeline flowing from Russia to the EU. This 3-day closure is ostensibly over unexpected repairs, emergency repairs in the pipeline. But it follows after Lukashenko just late last week, threatened to close the pipeline down if the EU and different member countries didn't lift their sanctions. And Putin didn't like that because, again, this is Russian gas flowing to the country. So my point is that came up late last week, and now, unexpectedly. This unexpected repairs that needs to take place. 3-day shutdown of the pipeline. I don't know. It seems a little bit fishy to me. A little bit sus. President Biden said on Tuesday that he made clear to China's Xi Jinping that his administration firmly stands behind the United States' longstanding One China policy, but he also noted that the self-ruled island of Taiwan ultimately makes its own decisions, later adding, quote, "It's independent. It makes its own decisions," end quote. The suspect who was killed in a taxi explosion in the United Kingdom in the city of Liverpool is said to have spent at least 6 months preparing for an attack by buying components for the bomb. And in holiday news, for folks who are wondering today, earlier on we said it was GIS Day, also Guinness World Records Day, and National Baklava Day. It is also National Educational Support Professionals Day, National Hiking Day, National Homemade Bread Day, National Take a Hike Day, National Testosterone Awareness Day, National Unfriend Day, and World Prematurity Day.
What, World Premature?
Exactly.
That's a day?
We take a moment to show compassion and support for families who are experiencing the anxiety of premature births. There you go.
That type of premature.
It's like a weird way to phrase it.
Premature
we all understand exactly. That sounds kind of, wait, what are you advocating there?
Yeah.
Anyway, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
That premature day sounds funny.
Exactly.
I had dirty thoughts when it was like, premature, what? I was like, you're celebrating that? But no, the take a hike day, even that is a little, go take a hike.
It's a little bit passive aggressive.
Yeah.
Although,
but no worries.
Hikes are great.
It's just funny.
I love hiking, but yeah.
Yeah, man. What's his name? Good conversation with Jim. Disagree with him on the last part, but definitely a good conversation on the things that are taking place politically in this country.
And by the way, sorry.
Go for it.
I'm sorry. I just want to go back. Paul Gosar, the representative we were talking about being censured and removed from these couple of committees.
He did that picture of him killing AOC or something, right?
He shared like an animated video depicting him killing AOC.
Which is just bad taste.
That's bad taste. And also, the kind of thing that it deserves this kind of censoring. Honestly.
Yeah. I mean, we've had Congress members basically get shot. What's her name? Gifford and some of the other ones. This is just bad taste. I mean, you should have some level of, I don't know, a basic, I mean, the reason why they say my right honorable gentleman when they're talking about, each other, the whole point of it is that you're in these kind of political conversations. The political conversations get heated, and they're trying to force a certain amount of formality in the way you deal with the other person, so it doesn't necessarily get to that point where you're fist fighting in the middle of Congress. Putting that stuff out may be great for his, meat-eating base, but it's not necessarily the greatest thing in the world in regards to somebody you have to work with.
Doesn't keep the tactfulness at, the highs that you might want to keep it at. On the other hand, maybe they say right honorable gentlemen to each other just because they're a class and they want to keep themselves separate as a class. There's a point to be made there. But on the other hand, totally, you shouldn't be sharing videos of your political opponents getting shot and killed.
Greatly frowned upon, to put it mildly. Greatly frowned upon. This love triangle thing, I haven't heard about this case. So he's basically saying, I killed the guy. I have to be honest, I've been watching some morbid stuff recently like the YouTube clips on either police investigations or interrogations or crimes, like this kind of true crime stuff. That stuff is so dark. Like, it's hard to get into the headspace of somebody who's like, yep, I got to kill that person. One guy killed his mom. And it was basically his girlfriend hated his mom. He sees his mom coming in the house. His mom says something to him about the girlfriend. He snaps, takes a string, and basically chokes his mom to death. And his girlfriend, who hates his mom, when she finds out, she just starts smiling like great. And it's like, dude, are you in, like, wow. Like the headspace that you need to be in to do something like that. And then when the cops are asking you about it, they're basically, no, man, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. I love my mom. Her and I were great together, et cetera. I mean, it's just out there stuff. What does it take for that person to get to that level of anger to say, I'm going to end that person's life?
He's saying it's not premeditated.
Yeah, he said it's a love triangle or something.
Yeah, and it wasn't premeditated, which is the crucial thing, I think, in a lot of these cases, whether it was hot or cold-blooded.
Yeah.
But because of that, of course, that's exactly what you would expect him to say. All of this just brings to mind for me, Brian Laundrie, what the heck happened there? Was the body his or not his?
Yeah.
Can we just get that? Seriously.
No.
Was the body his or not his? In the case of Brian Laundrie, the one they found in, like, Florida.
Yeah.
That was picked, and at first they said it was his, but then they analyzed the dental records, and it was unclear. Did we ever get clarity on that one?
Not that I'm aware of.
Really?
Which
Spicy.
Which is just weird.
It's super weird. That seems pretty quick to identify.
Because right. They did. Right off the bat, we found his body.
And then to verify or disverify, okay, this is or isn't him. It looks
like it would be one way or the other. It looks like they would know one way or the other. I mean, it then became, okay, how did he die? I'm still unclear on that point. Like, did he off himself? Because, I killed my girlfriend and I couldn't deal with it emotionally, so I off myself. Or did somebody else off him? Came across him. I don't know, man. That case is a very weird case all the way through, in the sense of the reasons that she passed, all that stuff. And all that stuff is this point, he took it to the grave with him. I mean, that's assuming that it's him.
That's assuming that it's him.
Yeah.
Because I remember on the back end, people in the studio were like, nah, that's not him. Yeah. That's not him.
It's like, there's no way.
If I were Brian Laundrie, and then this is where people's mind goes, like, if I were in this life and death situation, if I were, the subject of a manhunt, would I pull out my teeth? What would I do? And it's a kind of a fun thought process to have. But people were like, yeah, if I were him, no, I wouldn't kill myself. I would want to get away. I would pull my teeth out. I would do whatever I have. I would, pulling teeth out is pretty painful. It's like a line to cross for you.
I think it depends on whether or not you feel guilt about it. Like, are you, like, there's some people who really do accidentally kill somebody and they're like, oh my God, I'm pained over this. I can't, they have a hard time tolerating it.
And then other people are killers.
Yeah. Hardcore.
Even if they regret killing the person, that survival impulse wins out and they
got to get away.
Keep getting away.
Got to get away.
That's what I hear, at least.
I was watching this thing. This woman was basically interviewing serial killers. I think she said she interviewed like 20 serial killers over her life. And this was back during, where the people would contact her saying, hey, can you interview my client and have a conversation with him to see what's going on and why he's behaving this way. And her point was basically the majority of the people who turn to serial killing that are basically callous about it and everything else were oftentimes abused as kids, oftentimes had some kind of brain abnormality, either some kind of lesions on the brain or some kind of weird abnormality, personality disorder or something that basically incentivized the person to do it, with the stress and abuse itself creating this kind of perfect storm where the person just becomes basically an animal of all intents and purposes in the way they go after people and not necessarily care about the fact that they've just murdered all these people.
I know there are some myths that were like popular during the 70s that have since been disproved. So I remember there being this trifecta of, okay, if you hurt animals, if you light fires, that you shouldn't, if you're, you do that kind of thing. And if you wet your beds, which is the weirdest leg on that stool. Yeah, but there was this trichotomy of like, okay, if you fit these three things, then you're more likely to be a serial killer. It turns out, no, that especially the bedwetting is completely irrelevant. Cruelty to animals, certainly.
Yeah.
Lighting fires, I think there was still some association, but the bedwetting is like completely debunked.
Yeah, that was a weird one.
But you know what?
Unless they're saying they're beating their kids after they're wetting the bed or something.
I'm going to give you a TV recommendation, even though I'm like horrible at taking recommendations for media. Yeah. But we talk about this stuff sometimes.
You haven't watched Tenet yet.
Exactly. That's what
I can't believe you haven't watched that show.
Still haven't watched Tenet.
Blackjack, you got to get your brother to watch that show. He would love it. He's going to come back like, dude, I can't believe I haven't watched that show.
I need to go back in time and watch Tenet. It's a stupid Tenet joke. I haven't even seen the movie, but I know the basic premise. No, but Manhunter, I quite liked. The Netflix show, which I think they dead-ended it.
I don't know that one.
I think there's 2 seasons out, something like that. It's a sort of fictionalized account of the creation of the behavioral, the behavioral science unit. What'd you say?
In Canada?
No.
Canada has a behavioral science, behavioral unit where they talk to criminology and stuff like that.
Well, it's an FBI unit that was created in the 70s, behavioral science unit in Quantico, Virginia, an actual unit that revolutionized the psychological profiling of criminals, specifically in the case of this show, but also I think in real life, of serial killers, where they did sort of analyses and based on real life, based on actual characters, but of course it's a roman at clef, like a novel with a key or an idea, real events in a lot of cases, but they're using different names and different identities. Anyway, it's about you'd like it. It's about going around and interviewing serial killers. It's a great TV show where they're like psychologically profiling.
Dark stuff. Yeah.
Very dark stuff. But I know it's your kind of thing. It's kind of my thing too. I'm into Hannibal and those kinds of like the slightly more.
It's just wild hearing somebody say this like just extreme stuff. And sometimes like the BTK killer, when he basically recanted, like, telling all this stuff he did, he did this like 30
in Manhunter,
years.
featured in Manhunter.
Oh, was he?
He was.
He talks about all of these murders as if it's like he's doing groceries. It's like, I went to the house, I tied her up. The guy had a back problem, so I put a pillow under his back. And it's like, what? And then it's like, I choked the guy to death afterwards. It's like, so you made him comfortable before you killed him?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I wasn't heartless about it. I mean, it's like, dude, you just killed the entire family. And it's just very weird. This stuff is being talked about like it's just nothing. Like, this is what I did.
And BTK, while we're on it, just for anybody, I would assume that if you're not into... If you don't want to hear about it, you would have already seen it. Bind, torture, kill.
Yeah.
That's what it stands for.
Yeah.
Bind, torture, kill. It was like a sexual fetishization thing, which of course it is for a lot of the serial killers. And, famously, depictions of serial killers tend to focus on that aspect, even though it's not universal. But you think of, I brought up Hannibal, you think of the whole series, Buffalo Bill, these different characters. It's pretty all psychosexual for them. In real life, often the case, not always, but in his case, 100%.
Yeah.
And so there's this weird thing where he would get off.
And he did this for like 20 years. I mean, like, this was one of those things where he would do it, stop for a little bit, do it, stop for a bit.
Yep.
And, of course, he's getting older. He's, like, taunting the cops.
Taunting the cops in these letters, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Super
and then
weird psychology.
The stupid idiot didn't realize that forensics had advanced to a certain point where he put something out and they were able to track it down to him. It's like, dude. In fact, he even asked, he said, is it possible for you guys to figure this out if I do this? They was like, nope, can't figure it out at all. And then he ends up getting caught over that stuff.
You plot spoiled it for me, Jamarl. This series never went that far, so I never figured it out.
My bad. I'm sorry. My bad.
I'm just kidding. No, I'm just poking at you.
But no, man, that stuff is wild, man. That stuff is grim. Like, it's so dark. You're just looking at like, I can't get into the headspace. Like, it's hard to get into the mindset of somebody who's doing that. And is doing that over a course of like decades. Like, one of them was a nurse. Oh, we got to close it. But one woman was a nurse. And the only reason she got caught is because she outed herself. She basically said, look, I've been doing this for decades. I am no longer fit to be a nurse. And she just goes and basically tells all of these people that she basically offed while she was a nurse, dealing with elderly patients, and she would give them these injections of insulin, enough to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And because many of the people are older, many of them were elderly, they just kind of said, okay, well, the person just died. And she tells, I think, family members, they didn't believe her. They was like, oh, there's no way. And then she tells somebody else at the job, she tells her priest. Her priest is like, if you do that again, we're going to have to tell. It's like, yeah, but she's just told you she's killed all of these people. What are you talking about? And she eventually turned herself in. They would have never caught her otherwise.
Yeah.
It's just wild stuff, man.
That is wild.
Yeah, this has gotten real dark.
Let's go into a break.
Yeah, it got very dark.
Anyway, no, but it's triggered by that story that we were covering. And Jack was like, should I even add this? This is pretty gruesome. but I'll be honest, Jamarl, we throw those kinds of things in sometimes. And it's like, people talk about them. And also, I know you like, we talk about them.
Yeah,
that's
we talk about it. It's like a morbid fascination more than anything else.
Yeah.
My head doesn't work that way. And so it's like when I'm listening to these guys, it's like,
wait, it's like communicating with an alien.
Yeah.
Wait, where are you coming from?
Yeah, where are you coming from with that? Why did you do that?
Yeah.
Why did you think that? I mean, it's just really dark. Yeah, it's hard to get your head around that stuff. And then it's like you never know how many people you're bumping into.
Yeah.
It's like that.
Well, and people in the general, serial killers are interesting. But partly, people who are interested in psychology, I feel, often get interested in serial killers just because of exactly that thing. It's like you're in contact with somebody whose mind works completely differently than yours. And I feel like often, if you're not immediately, completely and forever turned away in dismay at the horror of what they did, you start to get curious. You're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And that's Manhunter, TV show again. I have no formal affiliation.
I'm going to have to check that out.
The main character is like that. He gets interested, and everybody around him thinks he's freaking crazy for just having this analytical, cold-blooded interest in how their brain ticks. You know, it starts to become a thing. But anyway, super interesting stuff, and for a reason. It's not just because it's morbid. It's because, okay, but wait, what's actually going on there? There's a deeper thing. But let's go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be coming back discussing once more the situation in Belarus on the border with Poland, a couple of recent developments. We got to in headlines we'll be investigating in more detail, including Belarus, the government shutting down the pipeline for 3 days on unexpected repairs, they say. Also rehousing migrants, hundreds of migrants who are on the border, now moving them on the Belarusian side into a warehouse. So some developments, that's on the Polish border right here, some developments that we're going to be getting into, also talking, of course, about Europe's gas and energy situation more generally. Ties into the Belarus story, of course. That's with Peter Oliver. We'll be discussing this when we come back with him. You're listening to Fault Lines, back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. And we've been talking about this throughout the morning. Basically, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus had threatened that if Europe added more sanctions to him because of the migrant issue, they were calling it a hybrid war, that he could potentially shut off gas going to Europe. Now, when this went to Putin, Putin basically said, yeah, he never said this to me, just never mentioned this, and that wasn't necessarily the greatest of ideas. And yet, lo and behold, there's an unscheduled maintenance on gas that is going to basically cut supplies in the short term. Now, whether or not this is overall cut supplies over the course of a month or not, we're unsure. But they basically made the point to say they hope supplies delivery quotas are still met. Either way, the point is that unscheduled repairs right after the threat was made to cut gas supplies. Have a conversation about this and other issues pertaining to what is taking place in the immigration conflict between Poland and Belarus. We're joined with Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, what's going on, my man? How you doing today?
Hello, guys. How are we doing? Yeah, I'm pretty well. Before we get to this, and there's a lot to talk about, so I'll be very quick. I couldn't help but listen to what you guys were talking about before you came to me. I would recommend both of you read The Psychopath Test by John Ronson to understand a little more about why people do those things. A fascinating book by the British journalist and documentary maker. The Psychopath Test. One of the you'll never view when you talk about these people moving around us and seeing them in everyday society. You'd be surprised how many people fit into the category of psychopath, including those that you hear being journalists talking about certain things.
Like a pig in their head.
Now we've got now I'm looking at constantly shifty eyes here. I'm looking peripheral vision. Who's in the room? Who should I be worrying about, Peter? No, I'm just kidding. No, John Ronson, I just pausing on that for a second, and you said brief. I'll try to be brief, too. John Ronson, interesting guy. I think I've only seen the one thing by him. He's the one who used to work closely with Alex Jones, known in America, like American broadcaster Alex Jones. They went into the Bohemian Grove together. Like, did they? The infamous secret gathering, if I'm thinking of the same guy, went into that. But also, John Ronson, you mentioned director Frank, and the man who stare at goats. Both of those movies. I like those movies. Anyway.
He talks about that trip with Alex Jones in his book, Them, which is another one I would recommend.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Cool.
Stare at goats. I wonder, does he know the real story on that one? The remote viewing
he wrote
thing
it.
phenomenal.
He wrote it. I'm pretty sure.
He wrote it. He wrote the real story. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. That stuff was real. They were trying to kill goats using some kind of psychic influence. Russia was doing all sorts of side work, and the United States was basically going in to see whether or not there was legitimacy to it. It was fascinating stuff.
See, Peter, we will go with you. You bring this into the conversation. Now, you said there's a lot to talk about. Obviously, don't want to spend too long on what's personally fascinating for us. Just take us into it. I sort of, going into the break, Belarus, a couple events happening overnight and this morning. What's happening, Peter?
Okay, let's start with the energy supplies that Jamal was talking about coming in there.
Yeah,
now,
unscheduled repairs. Right.
Yes, this is not the gas supply. This is the Druzhba oil pipeline that has gone in for unscheduled repairs. Now, it's you're not the only one that thought it was gas, because I was up at our Rupley headquarters earlier today, and it all went round like the tom-tom drums beating that the Jamarl gas pipeline had been shut off immediately.
Thank you so much for the correction.
Have they done that? Has he shut off the Jamarl gas pipeline? Well, because that is the one that was the initial threat from Alexander Lukashenko, that threat that was then countered by Vladimir Putin saying perhaps he was, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, perhaps he was feeling a little tired and emotional when he said it. Basically he was told that if Belarus was to cut off that gas pipeline, that Minsk would be in violation of a contract that it has with Moscow, and that opens up problems for Alexander Lukashenko with literally his only friend in world politics at the moment, which is Vladimir Putin in Russia. Really, everybody else is on the not friend list when it comes to President Lukashenko. It put it this way: when Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, earlier this week, had a phone call with her, like when presidents, chancellors, prime ministers, when they hold these type of calls, there's always a call list comes out of who did they speak to, how long did they talk for, and then it's up to either them or their spokespeople to say what they spoke about. On the call list, you could see President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, Mr. Alexander Lukashenko. Germany, although they reached out to talk to Alexander Lukashenko, they are no way recognizing his legitimacy as president just yet. So that's put that to one side just for now, and we'll come back to the energy situation. Yes, so they've shut down this Druzhba pipeline. Druzhba, of course, means friendship, which this doesn't exactly seem all that friendly, but, sometimes repairs come when you least expect them. The timing of this, though, seems a little convenient, considering that you've got one day Belarus saying we're going to shut off Europe's gas. The next day he's told you can't do that because you're going to be in breach of your contract with Russia. And instead of backing down, it seems we can't say it seems, it would make sense if he's done something that he does have access to, and he hasn't been specifically told not to do. And so we have some repairs taking place. They're expected to take place for 3 days. And Transneft, who are the Russian energy export giant, said it will and probably will lead to short-term disruption. This pipeline connects the oil fields in central Russia to consumers in Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Germany. This will have an effect even for the short term of these next couple of days. Now, we're also seeing other issues concerning energy in that area, because we've spoken many times on here about Nord Stream 2 and that particular pipeline. Well, we're in a little pause in the certification of that pipeline at the moment. It was completed earlier this year after many delays that were caused by the United States having sanctions in place. Joe Biden decided he wouldn't be sanctioning the Nord Stream company. That's Nord Stream 2 AG. They have, however, come across what is a very German problem, and that is a problem with paperwork. You might think that when it's something that involves so many billions of dollars worth of construction in so many countries, you would be able to get these things right. But what I can tell you from my own experience in my own almost 9 years of living in Germany, just when you think you've got it, there's always another page needs a stamp, and it's always the one you don't have. So the issue is that Germany cannot, certificate a pipeline, a project like this for a company that isn't registered in Germany. Ultimately, what it means is you have to have a sister company, a part of the ownership of it registered within Germany, within German law's jurisdiction. This actually, interestingly, can come back a little bit to what we've talked about previously under the rule of law and national law in the EU superseding EU law. Of course, that's a big dispute between Poland and Brussels. Little is really mentioned of the fact that Germany has quite a few issues with that as well. Anyway, that's by the by. This issue means that basically Nord Stream needs to set up a company in German territory, a German registered company. Once they've done that, and they have already done that, it's just a process, of course, to get that over the line. Then they'll be back through for the certification. Depending on who you listen to, certification is continuing whilst that registering of a company is happening. Some people saying it isn't, some people saying it is. I haven't got a definitive answer just yet from the horse's mouth, as it were, from the Nord Stream company themselves. We're still waiting on that. What it does mean, though, is prices are going up, and have certainly gone up just today, in fact, because of the problems in that Druzhba pipeline and because of what's happened with Nord Stream 2 being set back. We've seen this morning gas price in the Netherlands reaching a full-week high of €100 per megawatt hour. I don't know the euro to dollar rate at the moment. I could Google that if I was so inclined. €100 in dollar. I am sat in front of a computer right now. I hate to spoil the $120 around that, $115. So what you have is prices going up, prices soaring. That is not what people want to see, because they had started to level out a little bit. That was after we had assurances from Gazprom, the major Russian gas exporter, Russian gas company, that once Russia's siphons were full ahead of the winter, that they would start pushing more gas towards Europe, as long as Europe was willing to pay the now exorbitant rates that buying gas on the market is, unless they, of course, sign a long-term contract with Gazprom. Nobody seems to be forthcoming about doing that just of yet. Hungary were the last ones to do that. So you're seeing these gas prices going up at a time that they can least afford to do. We're seeing snowfall in some parts of Europe already. It is bitterly cold, I can tell you, here in Berlin at the moment. Obviously, that drives demand up. When demand goes up even more, the price goes up even more. And that's what we're seeing at the minute. And it is linked, as you were suggesting, to what's gone on in the relationship between the Belarusian and Polish border. Now, everybody yesterday was very keen to make sure that they knew that this situation regarding the certification of Nord Stream 2, that this wasn't to do with what was happening at the border there. This was merely, as I mentioned, a paperwork issue. It does seem convenient, though, that this paperwork issue has come up now.
It seems extremely convenient. And as a politically motivated thing, that would have me shaking my head and wonder, as I was yesterday, what the heck, well, what's their thought process here? Why are they doing this? But so just maybe we can focus in on that for a second. Maybe too much of this is on your implication or your interpretation of it, Peter, but do you think it's a good faith attempt by them? Do you think, not good faith attempt, do you think that this is actually just bureaucratically, they need that last T signed, or was there political motivation from up on high? Because I could see, okay, if the Western media narrative, at least out in public right now, is boogeyman Putin is threatening Europe's energy supply, getting Lukashenko to threaten to cut off this gas. The long-standing narrative has been, depending on Russia, destabilizes Europe because at any point they could cut it off. So I can see if the narrative right now out in public is, they're doing that, well, naturally they would turn. But in a couple of ways that doesn't make sense. But just going right into it, is it good faith on their part, do you think, Peter?
Now, and this is, I honestly do not have the crystal ball that would allow me to answer that definitively. What I can answer is based on my own experience of Germany in terms of how things are done here, my own experience of how things are done, not just even at the, the personal level, like I'm talking about me trying to do things, but at a serious multi-billion dollar, multi-billion euro business side of things. It is highly plausible that this was something, because the company being registered in Switzerland, it's done plenty of business here in Germany. Obviously, it has done plenty of business because we've got a pipeline finished. But the idea that it could be held up by something as simple as the need to have a company registered in Germany, I would entirely believe. However, it is extremely convenient, and it also comes as the German government, the still caretaker German government of Angela Merkel, has repeatedly said that they have no hand in the certification process, that this is an independent German body that does this. It is in no way linked to the German government whatsoever. And obviously, this would be a way that there would be no link to the German government whatsoever, but it would draw things out. And what is potentially an issue there is that it could draw things out until the new German government comes into play, a German government which would have the Green Party as a major player within it, as the second largest party in the three-way coalition, a Green Party who have been vehemently against Nord Stream 2. It's a long shot to think that they would be able to stop that pipeline now with so much money being built and as I say, a finished pipeline, a finished project. It's just waiting the rubber stamp. But it would be a very convenient way to drag things out and let them have the final say in whether it was allowed to go ahead or not, and in what form it was allowed to go ahead.
I'm curious. How long are they expecting this to take for the certification process?
Between 2 and 4 months. Wow. And this is why it's an interesting one, because it makes... Well, this is going on, and while there's so much resting on this for the next 15 to 20 years, this is potentially a huge money spinner for everybody involved. And amongst that, you include Gazprom of Russia and all of the jobs it creates at the Russian end. It does beg the question why, as is being touted, would Russia risk upsetting the apple cart by trying to invade Ukraine right now was being reported, up until literally this morning, at which point there's those people saying Russian troops were at the border, had to back down a little bit because the Ukrainian side said there's no Russian troops at the border. Apparently now the line is Russian troops have been moving or maneuvering in regions adjacent to the border or in the regions that share a border. Now, if you look at a map, quite a lot of Russian territory that those troops could have been moving, and remember, it is all within Russia that's happening. Also worth mentioning, a lot of this noise about Russia potentially set to invade Ukraine coming from the United Kingdom, and the UK has just done a $1.3 billion Navy deal with Ukraine. And the British Defence Minister was just in Ukraine as well. It is budget time of the year, and it does seem like it was all done to try and drum up a bit of fear in order to be able to say, we would like a bit more cash, please.
Good point.
Or at least keep the cash coming.
Something similar going on here in the United States, of course, with the NDAA, and also Lloyd Austin just a couple of weeks ago going to visit Ukraine, and you making that argument brings that to mind, for me with that too, of course. But there's also potentially between grift and some genuine geopolitical motive, between just trying to, like you said, shore up your budget going into the winter season, versus they're actually pushing for something or using this, not necessarily a war, but they're pushing for some to create the optical appearance that Russia is in the aggressive position on Ukraine, so they can get something. Do you think it's just grift, Peter?
I think a lot of it's grift. I think it's a very good state of affairs for companies for governments in Poland. Very good. The current government there, they get to say, look, we're the defenders of the EU's border. We're able to say, look, and we're the only ones that can keep you safe. It's also a narrative that runs right through the middle of the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Estonia today announcing more money to be able to build border infrastructure. That means walls and fences on its frontier with Russia. It shows up all of their positions in the ability to do that. It works for a lot of people, the idea that there is a boogeyman in Russia.
Yeah, I guess it does. That seems to be the prevailing notion of things.
And it's a carry-on of old habits, too.
If you create the bad guy, you get to say who's the goodie.
Right, well, that part too, right?
Invariably, if you're going to create the baddie, you get to be the goodie.
So let me ask you this. Is there any signs of this abating at all, the issue between, just going back for the moment, for Poland and Belarus?
Yeah.
Is there any signs of this abating at all at this point?
Right. The phone call between Angela Merkel and Alexander Lukashenko that I mentioned earlier on, that was a big deal. The phone call between Josip Borrell, who's the EU foreign policy chief, and Alexander Lukashenko, another big deal. Just in terms of them talking to Lukashenko, they haven't spoken to him since the highly contested election that took place in Belarus in 2020, and certainly not since the Ryanair jet was forced to land in Belarus and a dissident journalist taken off the plane there. We haven't seen any contact whatsoever between Lukashenko and EU leadership, so that's been a step in dialogue, which is always a right direction. We're also seeing today that there seems to be a de-escalation in that situation on the border, that people have been people have been taken away from the camps that were on the border there. Now, my colleague Igor Zhdanov has been on that border with people who have been sleeping in dire conditions. Almost zero water, seriously running out of food in freezing conditions, some of them in summer tents in a place that they've seen flurries of snow, or they're just dug into the ground. So the fact that that's happening, it does seem is being done to try and avoid a real humanitarian crisis, not that this isn't already a humanitarian crisis. So the reports coming from the Polish side are that this is de-escalating a little bit. This was after that people have been taken away from those camps. This is after yesterday, where rocks were thrown from the migrant side, from the Belarusians who were on the Belarusian side, towards the Polish border guards, who responded with tear gas and water cannon. I mean, I've had the misfortune of being shot with a water cannon on a cold day in Paris, and I couldn't wait to get out of those clothes and get warm within about 2 or 3 hours. It was awful. Brutal. The idea of having to sleep in those clothes after that, it wouldn't have ever, and sleep outside, that may have been the final straw for a lot of people. It is still difficult to find out what exactly is going on the Polish side. A lot of this is down to the fact that there's a 2-mile cordon that you're not allowed to get to. No journalists, no human rights workers, nobody is allowed to get past that line. Anybody who comes close to it is finding themselves in a pretty dire situation. Two of my colleagues from RT's France service.
On the Belarusian side,
you can get right up to the border. On the Belarusian side, you can get right up to the border. The Red Cross has been handing out whatever aid that they can. On the Polish side, you can't.
That makes sense.
Well, real quick.
On the Polish side, the only information directly in that. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say real quick about the Poland side. Europe, one of its main, let's say, provisions or rule sets has to do with if you step one foot into Europe, you can apply for asylum. I mean, something similar in the U.S. We basically changed that around. But in Europe, I thought that was kind of the rule set. Poland has basically changed the law, basically saying, well, no, we're not going to abide by that particular provision. It seems that the EU is backing them up on this. Why are they backing them up on this? Is it just because they accept that Lukashenko is basically playing politics with us and they don't necessarily want to give into it? Or is there some other reason for it? Because I can guarantee you the immigrants who are basically trying to cross, or the migrants who are trying to cross into Europe, definitely would want asylum. And, Shane made the point before, they're culpable. And some of the reasons that those people are even there in the first place.
Yeah, this is the rule. The rule is that you're supposed to, if you can get there, it doesn't matter. And there's a lot talked about illegal migration. Well, once you arrive in the EU, you can apply for asylum in the EU. Now, this is where it gets into the whole messed up world of EU asylum law, which nobody particularly agrees upon, because you're supposed to apply for asylum in the first country you arrive in. There is an increasing case being made that these thousands of people, let's say at the top end of estimates, we're looking at 20,000 people, that these 20,000 people who are in terrible conditions would not break the bank of the European Union, that the European Union could quite easily afford these people asylum. There is, though, a lot of politics to be played with that, because doing it how do they do it? Do they open up that border? In that case, then, do they encourage more people to make that journey to Belarus, even though that does seem absolutely impossible at the moment? In fact, Iraq has started to repatriate some of its citizens voluntarily who are willing to go back to Iraq. But it turns into a big issue, because what you had here in Germany over the weekend, here in Berlin, you had a protest from people saying, let these people come to Germany, we can take them in. You also had a protest, not in Berlin, but on the border with Poland, by people saying we cannot take these people in and they should not be allowed to come to Germany.
You also described militias, literal right-wing militias on the border.
Well, yeah, that was a few weeks ago that they were patrolling. The police had disarmed right-wing, what was referred to as right-wing militias. They did contain people who were from known neo-Nazi organizations. They were patrolling that border looking for people who had crossed, and police took machetes, bats, and other different types of weapons off them. The thing is, the EU can quite easily look after these people who are trying to get into the EU. But if they were to allow them to come in, I think there's a huge worry at the larger level over what message it sends. Then you have a situation of, do you try and do something similar to what happened in Turkey or what happened with Spain in Morocco, where you end up giving money to that nation to keep people there while asylum cases are processed. That would require the European Union to have more than just a couple of phone calls with Alexander Lukashenko. It would require cold, hard cash to be handed over. The fact that you've got Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's the Belarusian opposition figure, speaking to the European Parliament, I believe today, it might be tomorrow, I can't remember off the top of my head, suggests you are not going to see that, because there are certainly people who would see Tikhanovskaya as the legitimate president of Belarus. I don't think the European Union has gone as far as to declare that as of yet, but at the moment they count no legitimacy towards Alexander Lukashenko's government, and by dealing with them at this level, the level that would be required, the level that was dealt with when it came to President Erdogan, and the level that we saw to a lesser extent with Morocco from Spain, would require essentially, even if it wasn't direct, it would be de facto recognition of that particular government. And there is zero appetite for doing that, despite all of the horrible scenes we're seeing on the border with Poland. There's little appetite for essentially legitimizing Lukashenko from the EU side. And while that continues, there is always a problem that this is going to continue. Also, the fact that we are seeing hopefully some kind of de-escalation may mean that there's an end coming. Whether this closing of the Druzhba pipeline is part of that, we will probably never know directly if that is 100% a retaliation from Belarus, or whether that particular pipeline just really needed a clean.
Peter, we're going to end this here. I want to thank you for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Always a pleasure.
Explaining the stuff
Thanks.
to us. The voice that you guys were listening to is Peter Oliver. He's an EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You can follow Peter on Twitter at Peter G. Oliver _RT, and you can catch us reporting weekly on RT International. Always enjoy Peter coming on the show. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Let's go now to Cam, calling in from D.C. Cam, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
First-time caller. Thanks for the show. So,
thanks for calling.
One thing I wanted to mention to you guys whenever you have this Mark Frost guy on, because I know you were talking about earlier, him being an economist and all, is the other day he was mentioning specifically that, the U.S. is more developed and prosperous because it's free. And I just wonder if you could do a little pushback on him in terms of what he means by free, because even in the Civil War, before the Civil War, the arguments that slaveholders had was that their liberty was being suppressed to own property and to be prosperous themselves. And then his argument about how the Asian tigers, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea actually became prosperous is totally ahistorical. They had extreme control, public control over the economy. So, I would just wonder if you guys could get in a back and forth next time you have him on that specific definition of freedom.
If I remember correctly, I thought we did go back and forth on this with Frost on the last conversation. I remember that dialogue, this notion of freedom and everything else that Mark Frost was pushing.
We'll do it. And I think a lot of Americans kind of get where he would be coming from intuitively in the competition with China, of course, because the stance right now from the American side is they're authoritarian, we're freedom-loving. Now, that's American propaganda, clearly, but there's also an element of truth to it in some way. It's a difference between their centralized socialist state. Hey, even then, I can't say that because they've done a lot of decentralization in terms of local provinces being able to do their own things. But broadly, the narrative is the centralized socialist state. And Cam, I think you're saying, hey, maybe don't take that for granted. Actually start to get into that conversation, which is a valid thing. And I will do my best to remember to do that. We're, to be clear, planning on having him on tomorrow. Yeah. So we'll get into it then. We're going to be talking about inflation, but we'll get into that conversation with him then.
Yeah, totally. But like I said, if I remember correctly, we did push back on that. In fact, we had a caller who called in and said, thank you for pushing back on Mark Frost for pushing the freedom angle. And she went into it herself, basically saying how...
It was Pam, I think.
Yeah. It was later that evening.
Later morning. Later that morning.
Oh, what did I say?
Evening.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
Anyway.
But later in the show, basically.
Yeah.
But no, dude, totally. I totally agree with you on this. The freedom thing is a little strong. He tends to go with this notion of freedom, democracy, and economic freedom and allowing people to do what they want and everything else. But he completely ignores this notion of how COVID took place and how the number of people based upon that quote-unquote free system where profit is the only and main proponent or the main goal, how it basically undermined itself in all those cases. Or for that matter, China, 200 million people out of poverty?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, he could say, well, those are story, but after a while, I think even Shane pointed out, it's like, those are a lot of caveats that you're adding into that particular conversation in order to make that conversation work.
Even Shane, Jamarl. Even Shane. Act as if. No, I'm just kidding. I know where you're coming from. Now, Cam, are you still on by any chance? Or did he drop?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I was just checking. Here's where because I could get into this with you for a second. There is something to it, though, isn't there? Like, and you bring up the slave holders arguing basically, you know, okay, if you try to take away our slaves, you're taking away our freedom. God, the utter and horrific irony of that argument. But
they did think that.
They did think that. But at the same time, okay, you use that argument. But is that really, are you just saying, what's the point of making that argument? Are you saying that because he's making that argument that he's in that class or he's guilty morally? Like, you could be making the argument, you could be making a wage slavery argument, which is a controversial one to make very clearly in the States. But people do, left-leaning people do particularly. Would your argument be that socialist-leaning China actually guarantees more freedom than the States does because they do more? I guess I'm curious where you'd go with that, because I think you see the point. Their narrative is China's less free than the States. America has a lot of innovation. It's had a lot of innovation because we let people think and do what they want to, broadly speaking. And therefore, people have the latitude to figure out what works best in the sort of meritocratic capitalist system. That's the narrative. What's your, if you agree with that narrative as it's framed, at least that's the narrative. What do you think is wrong with it? Yeah.
I would say it's not necessarily, at least in my mind, a dichotomy between China versus the U.S., but one of a definition, and again, I may be repeating myself, but the definition of freedom. So I feel like freedom can't be conceptualized as a non-zero-sum game. I don't think it is a zero-sum game. So, the common libertarian trope of your right to swing your fist ends at my nose is definitely true. And I think that it does also apply to the economy. And I would honestly make not necessarily a wage slavery quote unquote argument, but one that is what level are there different levels of freedom in terms of an employment contract between an employer who can, say, fall back on savings for a year or so without seeing any reduction in their quality of life versus the employee who must work from somebody just to eat that same day. So those are two definitely different levels of freedom.
Those are.
So how do you determine? Yeah,
and this is, you could get into a sort of semantic argument, which would be a waste of time. We only have so much about what does freedom mean exactly. It's an important one to have, but again, we only have so much time. Clearly, those are two different sort of types of freedom. Legally, a lot of people would argue they have the same level of freedom. The employer and the employee, even though the employer can take time off and the employee can't because they don't have savings, they don't have the ability to build it up. People would argue legally they have the same rights, etc. On the other hand, clearly there's another version of freedom in which the first person has a lot more of it. They can do a lot more things than the second person can. And that's a semantic conversation. I would take that, socially, I get what you're pointing at in our society. But here's the thing. You say that freedom can't exist in this sort of zero-sum environment, nature red of tooth and claw, whatever. But capitalism, going back to Thomas Malthus and the reaction to him and everything that people learn from it, is capitalism, I think, is built on innovation, where you have new technologies that people create, where suddenly, it's not everybody just competing with each other over every last nub. You can do, there's this incentive to create new tools, new technologies that open the door to all sorts of new positive sum games. Sometimes. Like the sometimes. But I'm saying that's embedded into the argument. Again, Malthus arguing back in the 1700s, I believe it was, that everybody effectively, you're doomed to be the 1800s, I believe. Everybody is doomed to, you're going to have so many kids, you're going to produce so many things, but we're all going to get reduced to this baseline, basically, of poverty because people are just going to have more kids until there aren't enough goods to go around. This sort of naive thing, what he wasn't taking into account, looking back, everybody now states. Technology is that you create these new innovations that let you do more with less, and that changes this zero-sum game into a positive-sum game. So a lot of people would make that argument about capitalism that includes this way out of that contest.
But see, I wouldn't call that capitalism. I would just call that human nature.
Yes.
I mean, even if you didn't have a capitalistic system, the wheel, the triangle.
But that's the whole point is people argue that capitalism, by allowing the individual to profit from any given idea they come up with instead of the state, you incentivize people to create new innovative structures that create a more positive sum universe because you get more innovation. That's the argument. That's why people say that the U.S. will ultimately outcompete China.
That's the argument.
That's the argument.
I don't necessarily know if it flies.
But that's what we're literally talking about. That's literally the whole thing here is, okay, you guys should hit Mark on this. I don't know, Cam, what do you think about this? We got about a minute left.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you on that, but I would also agree with Jamarl that that's not necessarily capitalism as we conceive it. I would say that a lot of innovations over history have been done by the workers themselves that are then capitalized by the owners of those businesses. So I would say those same incentives do apply if all businesses are run and operated in some sort of corporate cooperative, I suppose, of individual businesses.
That does happen sometimes, but usually we call those people fools, I'm sad to say, because the thought is you could have taken that idea and made it your own thing. You just gave it for free to this company. I look at Silicon Valley and I say all sorts of people leaving these companies going on to start their own thing because they have their field of expertise. I'm saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that happens too. I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't call them fools. I mean, people just have different priorities in life. Some people just want to maximize their profits, so they'll raise the amount for a drug 100,000%.
Just from an economic rationality perspective, that's what where I would make that argument. You know what I mean? It's like you had that idea and you just gave it up for free. You know what I mean? That's a story. That's a trope. Anyway, Cam, thank you for the call. Like pushing back, I don't mean to shut you down. Thank you for calling in for the first time, too. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this morning show. You've been listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern. Have a great day, folks. See you on the other side.